Chapter 13. Who are you going to believe? Commander Kynaston had gone over Sun's report several times, trying to figure what their next move should be, other than to release the pirates from custody. He contacted Sir Richard Marchand and forwarded the report to his secure viewer. Sir Richard also went through it forwards and backwards while he pondered the situation. Commander, you know that we have been sending those pirate ships out there to scare the independent colonists into compliance. Of course, it doesn't hurt that they mine hard-to-come-by strategic minerals, and we'd like to know where they are. Kynaston thought some more and replied, Perhaps we can use this incident to our advantage. Why can we not enhance the video in such a way that it shows our cruisers coming in to save the day? It's the visuals that people focus on, isn't it? And we control the media, or at least most of it. Sir Richard said, Crikey, I believe that you've got something there, Commander. We definitely have to move fast on this one. Can you put your people on it double speed? When you are ready, I will grease the wheels of the top media and will push the cavalry angle. And make sure that you detain that freighter, the Farnsworth, was it? Come up with any reason you like, safety inspection or some nonsense. Find out what port they're entering and let me know. Then put the local constabulary on it. I'll put that in motion on my end as well, to make sure too many questions are not asked. Then put our pirates on ice somewhere, say at one of the JSO outposts. We'll decide what to do with them later. Aye, aye, Sir Richard. I believe we're on to a plan. I'll get my people moving. Commander Kynaston out. 20 minutes later, Captain Sun was given the orders he was looking for. Take the pirates and their ships to the isolated Northern Military Reserve on Mars. But let them be because they were working undercover. This puzzled him, but he figured that it was above his pay grade, just like his original order to observe only. Next, he contracted Mars Traffic Control to check the manifest filed by the Philo T. Farnsworth for their destination at ETA. It appeared that they were 4 weeks and 2 days out and on schedule for touchdown at Millikan Center on the frontier. Detaining them was going to be tricky if they pulled the same crap there that they pulled on him out here. But once on the ground, things should go much more smoothly. The best way to do it was to just pull their way through. Most people got very nervous, then got out of the way when tactical teams showed up armed to the teeth. He put in a call to the Royal Marines detachment at the Equatorial Military Reserve on the frontier, relaying the order from Sir Richard. They would have to get the Farnsworth and crew locked down when the time came. 6 hours later, Kynaston's technical teams had fixed up the logs from the JSO 0016 and JSO 0019 sufficiently to win everyone a Distinguished Service Cross. There was enough red meat for the news nets to feast on for a few days. Though Commander Kynaston had seen a lot of these things, both real and fake, he had to admit his people had outdone themselves this time. They melded in fire from JSO railguns and particle weapons to coincide with the pirate ships' movements and sustained damage. The communications track had been expertly dubbed with warnings from the JSO cruisers to the pirates, along with panicked voices from the Farnsworth. Finally, the conversation between Quintana and Sun was finessed to make Captain Quintana sound insolent and ungrateful. The finished product was transmitted to Sir Richard Marchand and was quickly approved for leaking to the press. The JSO logs hit the nets like a typhoon. It was everywhere all at once. Pundits, politicians, and prostitutes were online 24/7 talking about the implications. And since the primary corporate press was controlling the narrative, no one thought to ask about the point of view of the Farnsworth crew. Megan watched the carnage on the nets with alarm, but also with amusement. She knew that VLC would have to respond soon. She had been sent the unadulterated log transmissions from both Trevor and Captain Quintana. As soon as she and Trevor reviewed them, they put their own technical people to work in order to pick apart the claims of the treaty cheerleaders. Of course, it did not look good that Van Leeuwan was out to sea, as it were. In transit to Mars was the official story. Why couldn't he be reached for comment? It was a good thing that VLC hired clever, resourceful people. The crew of the Mickelson rigged up a compartment to make it look more like a standard Earth-Mars freighter's quarters. The better furnishings were placed there, along with some nice bookcases and lamps in the background. Trevor Van Leeuwan had given little notice that he would be making a statement regarding the video and its circumstances. He gave the press a 15-minute heads up, and some trusted alternative media a full hour to prepare, along with the names of some experts he had in mind, but did not know personally. Ladies and gentlemen, many of you have seen what is purported to be the logs of an encounter with the Van Leeuwan Industries ore ship, the Philo T. Farnsworth, and what appear to be 3 pirate vessels that did not identify themselves. The Farnsworth was inbound with a shipment from the belt to the inner solar system, specifically Mars, when it was approached by 3 unmarked ships that must have been trailing her. The vessel we call Pirate 1 is the one whose captain or occupants ordered the Farnsworth to stand down and be boarded. It is this ship that is moving toward the Farnsworth. You might also notice, as you review the recording, that views from both of the JSO cruisers are from some distance or appear to be magnified. Why would these 2 ships not close to cap to engage these pirates? They clearly have superior firepower, maneuverability, and speed. By not closing to their targets, they are endangering the lives of civilians. Trevor paused briefly for effect, then continued. You have all seen those alleged logs, as they have been played many times in the last several hours, leaked by some anonymous government source. What you have not seen are the logs made by the Philo T. Farnsworth and subsequently transmitted to our company headquarters. What you are about to see are the official log recordings of the incident in question. These logs have not been doctored or altered in any way, but they have been examined by our in-house experts and hopefully other independent forensic examiners when it can be arranged. With that, the screen changed to views of Pirate 1 as she moved into position and made her first threats. The most important facets of the incident were played or replayed from different angles, along with all of the audio. People had short attention spans. Trevor continued, the differences between these 2 accounts are glaring. First of all, why was there not immediate intervention by the JSO cruisers? Was it perhaps because they had no business being there? JSO maintained radio silence until the incident was completely over. Neither JSO cruiser pursued what we call Pirate 2, which got away, though she was clearly having trouble maintaining control. As Trevor spoke, the various portions of the logs were played, with each ship or aspect labeled on the screen. Take a look at Pirate 3 here with a side view. You will see what looks like sparks and molten metal enter and leave each turret as they are destroyed. The rear turret flies head over heels toward the rear of the ship. This simply would not be possible if a railgun projectile hit the turret from the rear, unless Newton's laws had been suddenly changed. On very close examination, in front of each turret, one can see some sort of debris moving rapidly toward it. Trevor paused as the individual frames clicked by. There were arrows added to point out projectiles moving in the opposite direction of the ship. We've estimated these projectiles to be moving at between 27,000 and 31,000 meters per second relative to the target ship. That would make a large mess, creating molten metal. If those are ironclad nickel objects, the spectrometers from the Farnsworth indicate that exactly. The plasma is almost pure iron, with a significant amount of iridium. I don't believe that the JSO is firing iridium bullets these days, though it is very difficult to measure their size from what video we have. If they were primarily iron, we estimate the kinetic energy would be in the right ballpark to do the damage we see here. There was no video which could clearly show the damaged engine spikes on Pirate 1. This was probably a good thing because it was not easy to explain. I have just a few more items for now before I make a final announcement. Number 1, what was the JSO doing so far out in the solar system? Number 2, what kind of battleships are those anyway? We've never seen the likes of any of them. Number 3, where did Captain Sun get off trying to order my people around? Number 4, our engineers have looked over those pirate ships thoroughly from the logs. They look very much like an older type Berkeley Arms design, heavily modified for long-range travel, with modular heavy weapons packages, meaning they can trade them out or demount them entirely to avoid regulations. And where, pray tell, would they make the swap? Number 5, VLC would like to inspect those pirate ships once the JSO has returned them to the inner system, and we would like the logs of the 2 cruisers released to the public for comparison. Finally, before I sign off, I want to make an announcement, Van Leeuwan continued as he sat back in his chair. I was going to wait a few more weeks, but now is as good a time as any. I will be taking up residence in the Mars new settlements, or periodically on a company site. With that, I will be resuming my seat on the Mars Frontier Council. This is Trevor Van Leeuwan, signing off, Birgitta said from off camera. It looks like it's really going to hit the fan now, boss. Van Leeuwan said. Tell me about it. It's going to be all hands on deck for this one. I hope you are ready in the reserves. Captain Lottie laughed her great laugh. Well, we tag-teamed those pirates pretty good, didn't we? Late at night, watching from his cozy study in West London, Sir Richard Marchand dropped his cognac, possibly staining his 200-year-old carpet. The expensive Australian cigar fell out of his mouth and started to smolder. His butler scurried around under him, trying to save the carpet as he stepped toward his viewer. Call Conan Dietrich, Sir Richard shouted. The communications network tracked him down on his private line. Ambassador Dietrich appeared in his thick white robe. Dietrich here. Hello, Sir Richard. What may I do for you at this late hour? I'm not sure, Sir Richard said, still flummoxed. Have you seen the news nets lately? That man, that upstart, that egotistical jerk, Van Leeuwan, is going to rejoin the Mars Frontier Council. It was the ambassador's turn now. A color drained from his face. He's going to go and get those settlers all riled up, isn't he? He has an easy shot at the chairmanship. They love him in the settlements. Sir Richard hadn't thought of that. It only made matters worse. He thought he'd better warn/recruit the ambassador on the PR front as well. You will have to catch the replay of his address ASAP. Things did not go as we had planned in the belt. They kind of got turned on their head. I still have to contact Commander Kynaston and find out what went wrong. We have to start slinging mud at Van Leeuwan's analysis as soon as we can. Call up whomever you need. You'll understand as soon as you watch it. Conan Dietrich pored over both versions of the logs for about 90 minutes total. The ambassador told the viewer to pause and to contact Malcolm Aldrich III in San Antonio, Texas. Soon Aldrich appeared, larger than life, in Dietrich's study. Yes, Conan, what is it? Still agitated, the ambassador blurted. Have you seen... Yes, interrupted Malcolm. I've seen it about 10 times now. Is that why you're calling me at this late hour there? Of course it is. We've got to get a handle on this thing right now. Did those pirate ships really come out of your yards? Malcolm Aldrich III seemed to have more on the line than the ambassador, but tried to calm him down. He thought the ambassador was made of stronger stuff, but then again, he had been given an easy path with fat government contracts his whole life. Very few times had he been called on to do anything other than write a big check, launder some money, or host a fundraiser. Don't worry, ships are sold and resold, flagged and reflagged. There's lots of ways to cover for that. We do it all the time. What I'm trying to do is to secure future business and future supply chains, along the lines of what you have accomplished. The belt and outer system have to be under our control. It's the best thing for everybody. The public had been told that interviews with Mr. Van Leeuwan would be limited while he was aboard the VLC freighter Lise Meitner in transit to Mars. The majority of the Lise Meitner's crew was not allowed to see him, as he was in a section of the ship closed to them for this cruise. They were used to the idiosyncrasies of the company, but they all loved the work. The captain knew that he was really aboard the Michelson, or would soon be on Mars. He had communications patched through to wherever he would be. They had to stick with the protocols of non-FTL travel and non-FTL communications with their inherent delays, both of which VLC had solved long ago. Another one of Trevor's many ancestors had slipped by Bell and Heisenberg to crack the communications via quantum entanglement. He didn't know it was impossible, so he just did it. Megan, the other executives, and their assistants were getting bombarded by calls from the press, all of whom knew that contacting Van Leeuwan during a transit was always problematic. If there were no more immediate statements from Van Leeuwan, then she was expected to be his spokesman, even though she was the chief operations officer. VLC did not have a PR department because they had never needed one. For the most part, she shunned them to one or two engineers in their forensic investigations section. They were becoming celebrities in their own right. In the meantime, the news nets and the underground media debated the questions ad infinitum, as they always did. There were some interesting questions this time. Questions like, what is the probability that just the right size asteroids would take out 2 turrets on one ship simultaneously? What were the odds that JSO cruisers would be that far out and in just the right place for the pirate attack? The people of the Mars settlements certainly took it to heart. There had been a quiet encroachment in their towns and villages from the government incorporated side. JSO craft had been seen orbiting the better-known asteroid mining operations for no apparent reason other than snooping. In the brief video downlinks Trevor made, he addressed several of these points. The Lise Meitner landed at Millikan Center right on schedule. That was the thing about interplanetary travel. There was no weather to mess up the schedules. The fact that Trevor Van Leeuwan had been on Mars for weeks was never detected. The press clamored for a view of Trevor at Millikan Center, but was shunted away from the executive section. They would start showing up at VLC offices now, looking for comments from Van Leeuwan. The very next morning at 8 a.m. Martian time, they were there, circling like hyenas. The Martian day was divided into 24 hours, just as on Earth. The only difference was that Martian hours were just slightly longer. Most people did not have any difficulty adjusting or even noticed at all. VLC headquarters was located in several modern, impressive buildings at the intersection of two enormous lava tubes. Directly above was a natural skylight where a section of the terrain had long ago dropped into the bottom of the tubes. The natural oculus was covered over in a thick glass composite which filtered both ultraviolet light and cosmic rays. The floors of the lava tubes were leveled or provided with rolling hills in parks and residential areas. To maintain a normal atmosphere, the tubes were lined and hermetically sealed with ventilation fans and CO2 processors placed periodically along the walls, though the plants took up most of it. Pumps powered small streams that recirculated the water flowing downstream through creeks, ponds, and small lakes. Subterranean, submartian pipes would bring the flow back to the headwaters. There was grass, trees, and flowers, along with bees and other earth insects to make up the balance. Along the walls and ceilings, away from any board or natural skylights, there were artificial lights tuned to the natural frequencies of sunlight and timed to the Martian day and season. Trevor showed up in his limousine today, though normally he would walk. He wanted to avoid the mob scene at his apartment and deal with it just one time today. He was dressed sharply, as always, in one of his newer resistance suits. Most people wore a resistance suit on Mars, which was a dialed-down version of the technology used in the exoskeleton enhancement garb. The artificial muscles throughout the suit actually worked against the muscles of the wearer. Wearing one could compensate in an environment with much less gravity than the Earth. Resistance suits were an absolute must for those working on an asteroid or small moon with very little gravity. Van Leeuwan's suit, on the contrary, was dialed higher than that of most Martians. Trevor's suit was dialed to mimic the 1.4 G environment of Magellan in the new system. Many on Earth wore them part-time as a fitness tool, since one rather forgot they were there. Van Leeuwan walked toward the building entrance with reporters shouting questions and his security people parting the crowd. He paused halfway up the beautiful blue-flecked pink Martian quartz steps to let them have their way with him. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, I have time to take a few questions before we get down to business, but first I would like to congratulate and endorse my friend Jacques Arama as the newly declared candidate for the presidency of French Polynesia. I have known Jacques for many years, and I know he will do his best to make a clean sweep through those islands. Okay, there in the sequence, very stylish. Katya, do you have a question? Katya Ivanova of the Earthside Observer asked, Mr. Van Leeuwan, are you going to continue your mining operations in the belt? Aren't you concerned about your employees' safety? We have no plans to halt operations at this time, replied Trevor. Next, there in front, please. Marjorie Sipes, Olympus Mons Journal. Mr. Van Leeuwan, do you think you have enough support to run for chairman of the Mars Frontier Council? Trevor answered, though it has not been long since my announcement, I believe my support is pretty high. Chairman Thornton has already told me personally he will not be running for re-election. Everyone else is still weighing their options. There in the back, Bjorn Eriksson, Scandinavian Daily. Is it true that you have not heard from the Philo T. Farnsworth for some weeks now? He replied, well, that is not exactly true. We know she is on her way home and is on schedule. Her transponder is still functioning. The higher communications channels appear to be jammed. We are still looking into it, though her ETA is 10:30 a.m. tomorrow, local. Anthony Tommaso from MarsNet had been waiting patiently to ask his question. Trevor always knew it would be a good one, but could also be upsetting since he had excellent sources. Okay, I'll take one last question before we start the workday, or I start mine at least. MarsNet? Anthony made sure he would be heard above the crowd and seen above the waving hands. Mr. Van Leeuwan, have you heard the rumors concerning the presence of disguised armored personnel carriers in the settlements? They appear to be JSO. Could you comment on this? A grim look came over Trevor's face, and he started slowly. I would like to confirm those rumors, certainly, one way or another. If that turns out to be true, it will be profoundly disturbing. We still do not have a satisfactory answer for why JSO cruisers happen to be in the vicinity of one of our ships, let alone pirate ships. We have no explanation regarding orders given to our people. I believe they were acting under the color of law, which is a crime anywhere. JSO has no reasonable explanation for being either there or in the settlements. They can operate anywhere in the vast uninhabited space of the solar system. This is true, but there is no justification for them in the settlements. Like vampires, they have to be invited in. I don't have a lot of sympathy for pirates, but perhaps the press should start asking about their disposition. If you remember the last portion of the Farnsworth logs, the cruisers were taking them in tandem back down the system. The activities of JSO and other encroachments in the settlements will be a major topic for the Mars Frontier Council in the coming months. Trevor waved to security that they were going inside. Reporters kept shouting questions, hoping he would take just one more. This was explosive, and they knew it was their story for some time to come. Chapter 14. Round up the usual victims. Back in his primary Mars office, Van Leeuwan had to get reoriented. He had not been there in some time, though the staff kept everything pristine. Though he had instantaneous communication with Megan, their days were still not the same length. Over about 3 weeks Earth time, her night would become his day and vice versa. They were in pretty good sync for now. He gave her a quick call, telling her he was in the office, and asked her briefly about how Jacques Arama's campaign was going. Megan replied, "It's utter carnage. Lavoisier is wetting himself. He never thought anyone would challenge him. I guess that is what happens when you live in a bubble of your own making. In the meantime, as his unofficial campaign manager, I get offers from this or that local potentate offering money, facilities, volunteers for canvassing this island or that one. I'm meeting with Jacques in a few days to sort through the donors who are trying to buy him off versus the ones who are really behind him. It's totally crazy." They went over a few housekeeping items and then signed off. His assistant, Roberto, buzzed him to say he had a visitor who had been waiting since before the office had opened. Trevor told him to bring the visitor in. In walked Funico Haruta, the owner of Haruta Metals, and she was not pleased. "Have a seat, Funico, please," offered Trevor. "Can we get you anything?" Funico fiddled with her dress a bit, straightening it, and said, "I would like some tea, please. You know what I like. Thank you." He could tell she was trying to regain her composure. "I'm sorry, Trevor, but I'm so angry I could just spit right now. After seeing what those bastards are getting up to, I believe there's a pattern." Roberto quickly came in with a tea service, and Trevor waved him off. "Just set it down and I'll take care of it from there, Roberto. Thank you." Haruta Metals had mining interests in the belt on Mars and Phobos. Trevor carefully poured tea and served it to Funico, then for himself. "Now you look flustered. Take a minute and tell me what's got you worked up. Normally a 12-pound sledgehammer would not faze you," he smiled. Funico took a deep breath. "Many of us have mining interests in the belt, right, Trevor? Some are known and some are not. We all accept that because secrecy is a big part of our security. Well, my people informed me on the last return delivery about a little visit paid to them on one of our unknown asteroids, not in the public record. This particular claim has some nice osmium deposits on it, and we expect it to last for years. Well, our visitors were JSO. We've seen them in other places like Phobos, where they will just orbit and I'm sure do all kinds of scans and images. Nothing we could do about it. They obviously spied on our ships and tracked them back to this mine. Well, this time they came down. They brought a pod down with 8 or 9 armed troopers and an officer saying they needed to inspect our facility. This they did, and nobody could really stop them. Of course, they had no name tags and wouldn't identify themselves in any way. They recorded a lot of information, then wiped our security logs clean so we couldn't release them. For the final insult, they grabbed some ore samples for themselves and lifted off." Van Leeuwan scowled. "Yes, we definitely do have a problem. I bet that you've been hit by pirates like we have. Plus, I had a personal run-in with some of the fixers, or their minions. It is so hard to tell which. When I was in Berlin, they wanted to bring me into the fold, as it were, so I would be protected, and they could make a killing. No doubt you have already been approached?" Frederico nodded, yes, and said, "Not yet this time, but I've always laughed them off in the past. They seemed inept and stupid, but I guess they get that way after years without any negative consequences for their decisions. I will do my bit, but I want to support you for chairman of the Mars Frontier Council. I know a lot of the others on the council will too. We have to stand together against this bullying." Trevor and Frederico tried to calm themselves down by speaking of more mundane matters, the state of the metals markets, the coming oil market, build-outs in their lava tubes and boreholes, and the revitalized Mars Symphony they had cooperated on. Trevor spent the rest of the day meeting with company engineers and subcontractors, discussing the progress of the pipeline he was building from the oil field to the settlements. The refinery was already in limited operation, with more of the modular sections brought from Earth, and a surprising amount fabricated on Mars. It was being built in a large cavern bored into the same side of the canyon of the Valles Marineris, where the VLC oil fields were located. Roads for the heavy equipment and tanker traffic of the early products were being widened and improved along the pipeline route all the way back to the settlements. Of course, VLC and their contractors were building these roads and had long experience doing so. The road was lined with emergency shelters every quarter mile. This was very expensive, but out here it could be a lifesaver for some stranded trucker or maintenance worker. Located along the pipeline route, they could eventually take advantage of water, fuel, oxygen, hydrogen, or other products once they were refined. Building them with a hydrocarbon or water jacket could shelter any occupants from cosmic rays the magnetic shield satellites could not divert, such as UV and gamma rays. The expectation was that there would be refinery hands, oil field workers, and pipeline maintenance residing out here. Eventually, they could take over some structures to start more extended settlements. Van Leeuwan was longing to go out to the drill site and have a look around, but he knew he would be stuck here for a while. The next day, the Philo T. Farnsworth touched down at 10:30 a.m., precisely in a loading bay pad inside VLC's compound at Millikan Center. Strangely enough, shortly before entering Mars orbit, her communications problems cleared up, but there was no time for interviews or other chit-chat while the craft was engaged with ground control during landing. There were reporters in the public areas of the port recording the landing, but they were not allowed in the operating areas of the commercial compounds. Naturally, they were anxiously awaiting the appearance of the crew of the Farnsworth. Such restrictions were ignored by others, however. As soon as the craft touched down, the rumors became fact. Reporters swore, and cameramen scrambled to record visuals as 3 large APCs capable of holding 40 troops and basic equipment raced through the public terminals out onto the landing grounds. The accelerators were maxed out as they shot toward the VLC complex in a cloud of thin Mars dust. One APC stopped on the landing pad while 16 to 20 men piled out of the back in pressure suits. They hauled out mooring clamps and proceeded to lock down each of the landing legs of the Farnsworth. The other 2 APCs sped onto the airlocks of the pad, where the occupants scrambled out of their vehicles and through the doors before they could be secured. It appeared from the terminal that each of those had poured out a full complement of troops in full gear. The reporters were already into or setting up their live links to the doings at Millikan Center. Another APC showed up and joined the rest on the pad. No one came out of this one. From the perspective at the terminal, there was no activity. Everyone was inside a vehicle or the gate structure. After about 20 minutes, the bay doors of the Farnsworth began to open and crew cargo unloaded as usual. The ore had been left in Mars orbit. Inside the gateway, it was a different story. Half of the troops double-timed it to the Farnsworth gate airlock before any of her crew could react, forcing their way inside. In the opposite direction went the other team, who pushed their way into the VLC landing complex main building. Ground operations were told that the cargo could be unloaded, but that no ground crew would be allowed to interact with the ship's crew. All of the troops kept their pressure suits sealed and their visors down, concealing their identities. Their gear looked like standard JSO self-sealing pressure suits, body armor, rifles, stun grenades, etc. Next, they started going through the logs while VLC personnel were helpless to stop them. They had internal encrypted comms, so it was impossible to know what they were saying to each other. Simultaneously, their comrades boarded the Farnsworth and systematically proceeded to round up the entire crew, barking orders to march this way or that until they descended into the pressurized gateway. Just outside of the Farnsworth's lock connecting the gateway were a couple of troops that appeared to be directing the others. "Which one of you is Katana?" shouted a woman's voice from a suit sporting captain's bars. The sound came through an external speaker mounted on the helmet. Captain Katana stepped forward. "And his first officer?" barked the captain again. Caroline Leike stepped forward with her captain. The JSO captain, or so they had guessed, told him, "Captain Quintana, you and your crew are being held as material witnesses under the Terrorism Act. Once you have been questioned and we gather any evidence, you will all be released." Before Quintana could utter another word, the two officers turned on their heels and marched down the hall, leaving several of their goons there to make sure they stayed put. Other troops were spread out over the rest of the ship, paying special attention to the bridge and the officers' spaces. Here, too, they concentrated on the logs, personal and company records, and the navigation computers. 4 of the troopers were going over every square meter of the ship with laser and holographic scanners, taking video, making measurements, cataloging every visible detail, and a few invisible ones. It wasn't figured they would have so much time before someone inside VLC would get organized with some kind of resistance. JSO had never been inside any of these craft that ran exclusively out of the frontier and mined in locations they had never heard of. What they hoped for was a gold mine of information to go with the intimidation. It was assumed that all of the records would be expertly encrypted. There was always hope with the shot callers. At least what was visual could not be scrambled. Engineers would be going over unidentified components or unrecognizable retrofits for months, trying to work out what technology was being hidden from them. The men and women doing this naturally did not know all the reasons why or question them. They were just following orders. Just when he thought the day might proceed peacefully, Trevor got the word about the Farnsworth. Remembering the reporter's question regarding the APCs, he quickly called VLC security out at Milliken and scrambled them to action. He wanted to know if they would be able to blockade the APCs before they could get out, or at least to try. They had no weapons, but they wanted to confront these guys in the open. The chief of security told him he would try to scramble as many vehicles as he could to form a cordon. There were a lot of heavy haulers and loading equipment that would be useful. If the APCs were still there, there was a good chance at trapping them inside the VLC compound, but it wasn't enclosed in any way. No one had ever thought of doing so because essentially everyone was security conscious, and this was unprecedented, or had been for many decades. By the time Trevor got the call, half of the VLC drivers and their immediate neighbors were in their full pressure suits, headed for their rigs. Trevor grabbed his own pressure helmet and hightailed it to Milliken to see for himself what they might be doing to his people. Vehicles for Milliken Center security, VLC security, and those of 2 or 3 other companies were moving into position to block the exits for the APCs. Meanwhile, the troopers had finished their business inside the VLC building and aboard the Farnsworth. They had the entire crew of 12, including Captain Quintana and First Officer Leike in pressure suits, hands bound, marching them toward the APC that had contained the mooring clamps. The mooring clamps had been removed and bolted to the outside of the APC. Now that there was plenty of room, the crew of the Farnsworth was shoved inside the APC and the rear door slammed shut. In a cloud of dust, the 3 APCs quickly moved back toward the passenger terminal, toward the settlements, with the 2 fully loaded units running a screen for the 3rd unit containing the Farnsworth crew. The reporters were having a field day, to be sure. All of this was live on the news nets, and everything else had been preempted. The experts supplied their own commentary, though none of them knew what was going on or how to explain it. Though these personnel carriers were big and fully loaded, they were designed for Earth, thus meeting the military specifications for Earth. This meant they were heavy, but powerful and fast. Being on Mars only amplified their capabilities. Gunning for the edge of the spaceport grounds, each of them in turn would briefly go airborne, as they took the moguls at high speed. They wove and spread apart, coming back together as they avoided the heavy equipment gathering to block them on the field. A cloud of fine dust was rising and spreading out behind them. The plan must have been for them to head straight through the new settlements and to disappear in the military reservation on the other side. The commander of these carriers must have been in contact with the higher-ups because they suddenly turned away from the settlements to go cross-country around them. By changing direction, they avoided the rest of the makeshift cordon and avoided more time on the reporters' cameras, such that it mattered. Cameras in the tower of Milliken's center tracked them as well as they could through the dust until they disappeared inside the military reservation. Van Leeuwan was in a vehicle with 2 company detectives as they got the call from the VLC Milliken compound. As soon as it was clear, VLC Mission Control got through to him to tell him that the entire crew of the Farnsworth had been abducted by the JSO Goon Squad, confirming what he had seen on the news nets in transit. He told the driver to head straight for Mission Control and the company cargo docks. The JSO group had just gone out of sight, and there was no chance of catching up with them now. The vehicle had barely backed into the airlock, confirmed the seal, and normalized pressure before Trevor and his men were through the hatch. They went straight to the terminal area, where they found the employees still shaken up, but mostly pissed off. Trevor and 1 detective went with the supervisor into his office. The other detective told everyone not to change anything in the room that was not vital to normal operations. It wasn't likely, but there may have been some evidence left behind. Then he began taking each one aside to get statements from them. Before they got started, Trevor called back to VLC security and told them of the need to get investigators aboard the Farnsworth to see what they could find and to drum up whomever they felt they needed on high priority. Those sons of bitches, spat the supervisor, Dov Gutenberg, as he paced his office. They just stormed in here and started pushing everyone around. It all happened so fast. They blocked the access to the Farnsworth, then started shoving everyone into the room next door. The good thing is, everyone remembered their training. I must have seen 4 staffers, besides myself, who hit the button to transfer and flush whatever was in the short-term memory files. This happened as soon as they barged their way in here. Van Leeuwan and Detective Armstrong just let him get it out while they recorded his statement. We didn't know what they might do next because they were armed to the teeth. I don't know what they expected, probably just a bully factor. The whole group was fantastic, though. No one said a single word, also right out of the manual. We never saw their faces. Everyone was in full vacuum regalia, including the visor. No names, no faces, no badges, no numbers. There was some rank insignia, though. I saw 1 captain, 1 lieutenant, and a corporal, but I'm not sure about the last one. They were in a big hurry. I guess they knew there was only so much they could get away with in one go. When we came out of the other room, a couple of my people saw them trying to access the computers. A couple of them were walking around the control room with scanners like they wanted to take the whole thing with them and rebuild it somewhere else. Van Leeuwan stayed at the control center for a little over an hour. He knew there was nothing else he could do here, but he wanted to support his people. He knew it would help if he let them vent for a while. He shared their anger, so perhaps it was cathartic for him also. On the flip side, he felt that whoever was responsible for this stunt wanted him to remain off balance. By responding right away, in some dramatic fashion, he would only feed the monsters. He would respond, but perhaps not in the way that they were hoping for. The news nets would stir up the frenzy, and his friends, known and unknown, would respond for him through their broadcasts. What he had to do was think ahead to what tactics his enemies would use for spin this time. How would they go about turning their victims into perpetrators in the eyes of the public? For now, he tried to communicate this to his people, who were pretty savvy, but were still people. They might not all have his patience to stay silent for the short term. He had confidence in them, though, and by the time he left, they had calmed down considerably. He returned to VLC headquarters alone. The detectives stayed on to take charge of the additional teams who were en route to do more detailed forensics at the control center and aboard the Farnsworth. Back in his office that afternoon, Van Leeuwan told Roberto to hold all but the most urgent calls, meaning no calls from the press or for anything he considered low priority. Roberto had been with him for some time and could read him almost as well as Megan could. He knew he had to get his people away from those orcs. It was almost a move of desperation to have them taken in the first place. He spoke with some company lawyers to start them on applying pressure on whomever they felt might budge. This meant the military arms of whatever governments were sponsoring the JSO and the governments themselves. Through intermediaries, he contacted various watchdog groups to also apply pressure. Finally, through other third parties, he started the ball rolling in the alternative media, asking questions about 1. Where was the crew of the Farnsworth? And 2. Where were the crews of the pirate ships and the ships themselves? From his Mars office, Van Leeuwan only issued a short statement demanding the return of his employees, who had been taken under no recognized authority from private property on neutral ground. The JSO office responded just as briefly by saying, the crew of the Farnsworth is being held as uncooperative material witnesses to attempted hijacking and piracy. Piracy is an offense under the Terrorism Act. There was a lot of other pseudo-legalese with which to wrap up this nonsensical justification of kidnapping. No mention was made of the fact that it was the crew themselves who were the intended victims of a crime. The problem with the JSO and so many other TLAs, three-letter agencies, was that the origins and chartered purposes of so many were long forgotten and held on to legal standing by only their fingernails. An agency created by another agency with only a brief outline and some massive spending bill shoved through at the end of a long dead session hardly had the blessing of the people behind it. The people had nothing to do with it, really. The people who paid for it all, with a gun to their heads, but unable to understand it, could only be comforted by the Stockholm Syndrome induced in them since they were infants. In the end, the agencies were discussed by politicians and pundits as if they were legitimate entities with some kind of real backing. The fact is that very few people bother to check their legitimacy. They would rather go with their feelings and hope that whatever happened to those other people would not happen to them. Those who did bother to check on the real pirates were held hostage by a legal system that would bankrupt them before giving them a straight answer, let alone justice. This court system is run by the same people who gave them the three-letter agency, or worse, it is an administrative court run by the same agency doing the damage in the first place. The JSO was one of the more shadowy entities. In fact, they owed their existence to some long-ago executive orders from various participating governments, by virtue of the fact that their funding was reflexive, with most of that being dark, i.e. line items redacted from the budget, and no oversight. They thrived. The JSO was funded by several governments, yet accountable to none of them. It was much like the Five Eyes system in the old days. There were many more eyes now. Who knew how long the Philo T. Farnsworth's crew would be kept on ice, or what was happening to them? The main thing Trevor had working for him, or hoped to, was the support of the Mars frontier settlements. Chapter 15. Friends in Low Places. Long ago, governments had a monopoly on Mars colonization. Having extorted so much money, they were the only ones who could afford to get there. Consequently, everyone had to play by their rules, or their funding would dry up, and that would be that. Of course, every dime or euro taken was for the benefit of all. But by the time the all were paid off, what was left? Space vehicles and colonies were designed by committees with endless delays, taking 3 times the money required to build them. The more clever and far-sighted innovators on Earth put their money and talents behind their own technology and management skills. They saw opportunities on Mars and beyond, both material and spiritual. Soon they were able to build their own ships that could make it, land, and start exploration and settlements. In some areas, with only a little dust to hide them, they could harvest meteorites full of valuable elements directly from the surface. There was nothing on Mars to grow over them. The government compounds continued to build, often licensing or buying technology from the entrepreneurs of the unincorporated sectors. By the time this happened, the technology had already advanced once more. It wasn't total gloom and doom in the government zones. There were several designs and discoveries that emanated from there. They just did not happen as often, and innovators were not always given the credit they were due. Generally, fresh ideas would die on the vine as often as they would be implemented because the higher-ups were just too afraid to try for fear of any failure and loss of funding. On the frontier, necessity was the mother of invention, and sales were a necessity, since the colonists could not extort money from their neighbors. Eventually, the growth rate in the new settlements began to creep past that of the government-controlled sectors, and that made the bureaucrats nervous. Locally, many began seeing the Mars colonies as a one-to-one comparison between top-down kleptocracy and spontaneous organization. For the last 4 days, Quintana and Likey had been separated but had enjoyed the same routine. Each would be marched into a room to a table where there would be coffee, bagels, or other inducements. In front of them was an opaque screen covering the front of a table where a panel sat with 3 to 5 people, depending on the day. Twice each day, for about an hour, depending on when the panel decided to give up, they would be peppered with questions. These were inquiries regarding their routes, destinations, transit times, other incidents with piracy, company policies on piracy, their career experience, navigation systems, and almost anything else under Sol. Quintana sat there absolutely silent, with only the sound of him spreading cream cheese on another toasted bagel or the slurping of his coffee when it was too hot. This place had a decent library, and he knew he was earning double overtime as the company worked to get him and his crew out of here. After a while, Carolina Likey could tell who was a general or admiral, who was a politician, who was a psychologist or engineer asking the questions. She would have them on a bit, seeing how far she could bait them, or she would talk about her cat for 20 minutes. She never said a word about her job or what the captain's orders were or anything about her fellow crew members. Like Quintana, she had confidence in the people around her and knew this could not last forever. On the outside, people were asking questions. People in the frontier settlements were organizing themselves and picketing various government enclaves and offices. They besieged the call-in programs, where the hosts were not towing the official party lines, but were shut out of primary media outlets and chat streams. Van Leeuwan made a rousing speech at the Mars Frontier Committee meeting as he resumed his seat. Various politicians and pundits were talking in circles about the Terrorism Act and how it applied. Half of the callers for those programs strongly advocated that everyone do exactly what the JSO told them to do. They were convinced that the JSO was there to protect everyone, and parroted phrases like, "They put their lives on the line every day for you and me." They made their ignorant comments out of fear, knowing nothing of the JSO or its forebears. Van Leeuwan retorted, "As for the application of the Terrorism Act, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The burden of proof is on the abductors of my crew, and nobody else. Show me how it applies to my crew." The captain and the crew of the Fido T. Farnsworth were victims of an assault, and they were being chastised as criminals. At around 2:30 a.m. on the 5th day, Quintana, Likey, and the rest of the crew were awakened and told to get dressed, and to take any of their personal effects with them. They were allowed 15 minutes to get ready. There was a dark-skinned man with dark hair who had a military look and was anywhere between 40 and 60 years old. He was dressed in civilian clothes and dark glasses, but he was definitely in charge. 4 of the guards were accompanying him, wearing darkened face shields as they motioned the crew out of the holding area and down the long corridor. All the man said, in an Australian accent, was that they need not be nervous. They were going home. They were back in the lava tubes. The lights had been adjusted to night setting. Here and there, stars were projected on the ceiling and walls in their proper celestial order, while they could hear crickets chirping. A line of automated taxis were waiting to take them wherever they wished to go. The crew of the Farnsworth thought it best if they all returned to VLC headquarters for debriefing. They wanted to report in and let their families and friends know they were all in good shape. Van Leeuwan was notified immediately by Quintana as they pulled away from the international compound. He quickly got dressed to meet them there. There were hugs all around and a little champagne, but they were not going to stay up all night. It was time to get home to their loved ones. They could report into security tomorrow for debriefing and take some time off if needed. Debriefing the next morning did not take very long. Trevor had assigned a security officer to take each of their statements on a one-to-one basis so they could be in and out. Most opted for their standard time off as they were just coming back from a cruise. Quintana and Likey wanted to get caught up with some reports and get up to speed on the latest scuttlebutt, even though they were it for the most part. They were anxious to get back to the Farnsworth to see what had been done to her and to help the investigators. Trevor let the crew know that they were free to appear on any of the news nets or talk shows and say anything they wanted about their adventure, save what was proprietary to the company. All of them should feel free to consult with the company lawyers about their individual cases. If they wanted to file suits on their own, they could do whatever they wanted, but a coordinated legal strategy was likely far more effective. They would be one of his best weapons in the short term. The official line on the news nets later that day was that the crew of the Farnsworth had been released on humanitarian grounds. The JSO office issued a short press statement of their sympathy with the ordeal suffered by the Philo T. Farnsworth crew in deep space. Of course, the right to subpoena any of the crew at a future date was still reserved by the JSO or their home countries. Never leave out any threats if possible. The press tried to contact the Public Relations Department or press secretary for the JSO, but it seemed that those did not exist. Evidently, this had been an oversight of the oversight committees. Van Leeuwan issued a company press release asking the question, why was this great humanitarian act done in the dark of night? His statement went on to say that he thought VLC was thankful that the crew seemed to come through their experience unscathed. The company would be seeking both legal and moral redress for the unexplained actions of the JSO and its sponsors. Nobody knew what this meant exactly, and that was the way Trevor wanted it. All was not well within the government and military compounds. From the outside, everyone was quiet and stoic. This was what the public was expected to see. Even on the inside, everything was so compartmentalized. The woman in one cube did not know the man in the next was at the end of his rope. The release of the Farnsworth crew had several people's hair on fire, though no one could say why. It was obvious without extensive enhanced interrogation, a term lifted right out of the Gestapo manual, that there was to be no useful information to be gained from them. The longer they were held, the worse the situation became. But there was no one here with guts enough to stand up and say so. His comrades would take enemy fire any day of the week for him, but to disagree with the hierarchy was anathema. After sitting on several panels for days peppering these poor people with ridiculous questions, the new deputy commander of the Mars Equatorial Military Reservation had had enough. It was time to cut the Gordian knot, so he wrote orders for the prisoners' release. The orders were signed General Giamba Campbell. He had spent his time since then getting chewed up one side and down the other by several officers he had never met, all of whom claimed to be in charge. He was a step ahead of them, though. From all the briefings he had been given, there was nobody in charge of this debacle. This was another off-the-books op, where there was no clear paper trail of orders. He took their chastisement calmly. At the end of each session, he said, "Okay, if you wish to pursue this, then let's have a court-martial." This ended the session rather abruptly, and he never heard from them again. Of course, there were more devious means to get rid of him, but as it turned out, those going after him the most vehemently were grateful he had put an end to it. Van Leeuwan was definitely right about Mars getting interesting. General Campbell followed his gut and put in a transfer to this posting not long after the conference. He was surprised how quickly he was approved. Then he remembered how puzzled he was for being included in Trevor's ambush at the Berkeley Armaments hospitality suite. Perhaps they wanted him here to keep an eye on Van Leeuwan. He'd heard of officers being groomed for various tasks or posts, but never thought anything more about it. No one thinks it will happen to them, or if they do, they are highly susceptible to flattery. There were more clandestine means, of course. As a manager, he was capable of getting people to do things they did not want to do when prompted by a motive he had planted there. He felt that this was what a good manager did to keep people engaged and focused. He was beginning to see the powers that be from a different angle now, an angle he did not particularly like. Being manipulated always rubbed him the wrong way. He had served on Mars briefly in the past and decided to resurrect some of his old civilian contacts to get the lay of the land. There were also a few friends who had retired from the military and had opened businesses in the new settlements. Like him, they had begun to question what they were doing late in their careers and just who they were doing it for. These men and women had a sharp eye for detail and efficient bullshit detectors. In an environment of continuous spin by the media and governments, the primary emphasis was on the very existence of pirates. Were the people of Earth, Moon, Mars going to be safe in the foreseeable future? Everyone saw that the Philo T. Farnsworth was not capable of defending herself. She could have been captured lock, stock, and barrel out there where there was no protection. Had it not been for the JSO ships that just happened to be present, she would have been lost. Who knows what would have happened to the crew? Would they have just been blown out of the airlocks or shoved into escape pods like the others before? Would the ship have been reflagged or sold for scrap? The narrative had been pushed into higher gear because the headwinds for the intended message were strong this time. Never say die. Alternative media was growing on Earth, but much more prevalent on Mars, especially in the new settlements. These outlets were governed not by some arbitrary political entity waiting to yank their license, but by whether or not their information was reliable. Even the advertisers had to play ball. The Farnsworth logs were getting a lot of views and a lot of independent analysis. Well-respected scientists and engineers had publicly vouched for their authenticity as unaltered logs, though interpretations varied a bit. Similarly, the new settlements contained several private security agencies, investigative and forensics agencies, as well as arbitration centers. VLC internal security was highly respected, among others for their level of detail and accuracy. Plenty of lip service was paid to the official investigation, which was on the fast track to nowhere, the standard delay tact. The whereabouts of those 3 pirate ships was still a mystery due to the ongoing investigation. All kinds of psychologists and government officials were online with their pet experts gaslighting audiences, telling them not to believe the VLC logs. The primary news nets, naturally, shot down any explanation other than their own as conspiracy theory. Shouting down their opponents was completely childish, but a tried and true method of argument, still appealing to a core audience. The main goal was to promote and amplify public fears of piracy and terrorism. Convincing them to give up more of their liberty was always the key to safety. The various branches housed on the Mars Equatorial Military Reservation never really had an enemy to fight. Consequently, they gathered information on just about everything and everybody around them. They had to justify their black budgets somehow, and laws were for other people. As deputy commander, General Campbell had clearance for nearly everything they told him about, at least. He perused the files on VLC operations and on their key personnel, including Trevor Van Leeuwan. The files were surprisingly sparse, containing mostly publicly available information. Jemba marveled at what was either the ineptitude of the military or the tight security of VLC. Van Leeuwan could be very unpredictable, but there were a few haunts in and out of the settlements where he could be found that were out of the way and on a semi-regular basis. Wanting to meet with Trevor without a lot of prying eyes, he picked 3 places and staked them out at the appropriate times. Dressed in civilian clothes, Jemba was just about to give up on his second pick when Van Leeuwan came in. This pub, the Francis Drake, was a bit seedy, but it was not too far from Milliken Center. It was dark, like a college bar filled with booze or picnic benches, big wooden tables carved full of names. Trevor made his way to a booth in the back, nodding to the bartender on the way. The nod meant to bring him the usual. The barmaid brought him a tall, dark brew in a tankard, and he sat back and took a long sip. Once it looked like he had gotten comfortable, Jemba slowly made his way across the room, taking his half-finished lager with him. As Jemba was nearly there, Trevor's eyes opened wider in recognition. "Well, hello, General. You are a long way from Berlin in Australia. Please have a seat." Trevor, while shaking Jemba's hand, called the barmaid over again. "May I refresh your drink, sir? And if you have not eaten, you must have one of their burgers on me. That's why I come here. They know me and know I always order the same thing." After looking at the menu, Jemba obliged Van Leeuwan and ordered the same bacon cheeseburger he was being served. with the same killer French fries. "So you decided to see for yourself what Mars is all about?" asked Trevor. "I suppose you could say that," answered Giamba. "My tour as attaché was coming to an end, so I was thinking of trying something different when I met you. I wasn't getting anything more out of it professionally, if you know what I mean. I'd been to enough cocktail parties and talked to enough politicians." Trevor didn't know what it was, but there was something about Giamba that he liked. Once he was not in uniform, and in a setting like this, he spoke more freely. "Perhaps you did put the Mars bug in my ear when I was especially open to suggestion." The general laughed. But on a more serious note, he paused while he was served his burger and fries. "Hold on a second." Giamba prepared his burger and took a good bite. "You're definitely right about this cheeseburger. I'm glad I waited." Finishing off his lager, he slid the fresh one in front of him. Giamba said, "I need a little more beef before I start on that next lager. I've been here for about an hour and a half waiting for you, so I need a little more food to balance the beer." Van Leeuwan frowned as his radar went active. "Waiting for me? You mentioned a more serious note. And how did you know I was going to be here?" the general said. "Let me back up a bit here so you get the full picture. I definitely did come to Mars on a whim, as it were, to try a different direction. Again, I believe it was our meeting in Berlin that pushed me in this direction." Giamba told Trevor how he had barely gotten his orders when the whole piracy incident hit the news. "Right away when I arrived, I noticed how much tighter everything was on the base than my last tour here 20 years ago. So many areas are off limits to this group or that one. Rank has some privileges." The general told Trevor how he was shanghaied to sit on the ridiculous interrogation panels for VLC crew members. Van Leeuwan was getting a little hot under the collar until Giamba told him how he finally put an end to the charade when everyone else was too paralyzed to make a decision. "So anyway, I know a lot of things now that many would prefer I not know. I got chewed out a bit, but they only did it for show, in my opinion. It's all part of the thin green line, as it were," smiled Giamba. "That was such a shit job they did on your people, mate. I still don't know who's pulling the strings, but I've got my eyes open. That's why I wanted to meet with you out of the way. Maybe there's something else I can do to make it up to you." Trevor was cautious. He still didn't know if this was some kind of setup, but he went with his instincts. "Well," Trevor paused, "it doesn't take a lot of deductive power to conclude that the pirates, the JSO, politicians, and some key contractors are likely all on the same team. The participants may or may not know it themselves, but someone is manipulating a lot of pieces on the board." Giamba continued, "I may be able to help you with part of the mystery, for what it's worth." To anyone else in the bar, it looked like the general was handing Trevor a business card, which he was. Stuck to the card, in the corner, was an optical chip, which Trevor slotted into his viewer. He was astounded as he flipped through the logs of each of the 3 pirate ships, plus personnel files on every member of their crews. There were navigation logs for an entire year for all 3 of them. Finally, there were images of each of the ships parked on pads, with what appeared to be a large mountain in the distance. It looked like Olympus Mons. Giamba was silent as Trevor scanned through the files some more. It would take days and several more people to absorb this intelligence coup. Then he added, "It was the only chance that I came across this set of files. There seems to be a lot of tension and confusion at the base. Some people were getting sloppy with their security measures. Several of the printed stills were in a folder of one of my fellow panelists. I nicked the electronic file in the folder while he was on a bagel break and made a copy. At the time, I was just thinking of insurance for myself, but perhaps it can help you as well." Those pictures of the pirate ships looked like they were taken at the Mars Northern Military Reservation. It's pretty isolated. In fact, there are no real settlements there at all. Van Leeuwan slid his plate to the side, but continued to nibble at his fries. He took a good sip of his beer and sat back. "Have you been to the Northern Reserve?" The general replied, "Yes, but as part of a quick tour of the area. It's in the southeast part of the Amazonas Plantia, in the middle of nowhere." Trevor scanned through the files again and enlarged the photos of the 2 damaged ships. "You see these heavy weapons? You see the railguns, the particle or laser weapons, and the more conventional cannons?" Giamma nodded. Yes. Well, said Trevor, they look to me like they're on a kind of quick change modular mounting system. Are there facilities on that base where armorers could swap those in and out? The general looked up, trying to recall what he'd seen there at the base long ago. The cannons could be done anywhere, and no one would notice. I don't know about the turrets, but I wouldn't think so. Those are big suckers. If it were me doing it, the best place would be a large asteroid or moon out of the way. Gravity on Mars is low, but it would still be a hassle. On an asteroid, moving them around would be easy, and it's off the beaten track. What about those turrets and their weapons packages? Am I going to find them in Jane's fighting spacecraft? Smiled Trevor. Now it was time for the general to get serious. No, Trevor, I have never seen those before. They are not as powerful as what the JSO is using, but they look pretty sophisticated. They don't look like they came out of someone's garage. They look like a government contractor built them. With enough study of the images, one might be able to identify the armaments themselves out of a catalog like Jane's, unless they're completely custom-built like the turrets. The problem is that the turrets cover most of the details of the weapons. There's a black market in military arms, but specialty stuff is just that, specialty. Van Leeuwan resumed. I'm certainly grateful for your expertise, and I really appreciate your giving me this file. You are taking a big risk. You saw that we released our own logs despite that Hollywood crap put out by the JSO. You don't believe they could have made those long-distance shots either, do you? Giamma said. No, I don't, and I find such fortuitous meteor strikes to be highly improbable. As for the risk, I don't think that will be an issue. I'm a pretty good judge of character. I know you will be very discreet about how you use that information. It's the very least I could do for your people, and probably the closest thing you will get to an apology from anyone at the reservation, smiled Giamma. Your crew is top-notch. No one got nervous, and not one of them said a word that was worth anything. I'd love to have an entire battalion of blokes like that. Van Leeuwan said, We do try to hire the best. We put them through quite a screening program. It's not easy sitting in those cans for weeks at a time, getting on each other's nerves. There's a lot of training involved, and it takes a special kind of person to do it. The general stood up and said, Well, I better be getting back, or the gossip will start buzzing. We might want to meet again periodically. Is there a discreet way I can get in touch with you? Trevor thought for a moment, then said, Yes, get in touch with the bartender there, Mick. He's completely trustworthy. Just tell him you're looking for me, and he will forward the message. If I want to meet with you, I will do the same. He will pass on the time and location. We should have code names, as hokey as that sounds. I don't want Mick to get into trouble. As the general was putting on his jacket, he asked, One more thing, Trevor. Did you see there how some of the aerospikes were caved in on the lead pirate ship? I'm not an engineer, so I'll defer to you. How do you think that happened? Van Leeuwan looked puzzled. Yes, that's very interesting. I've never seen damage like that before. One would have to get a closer look at it to get a better idea what happened there. Chapter 16. The Plotters Thicken. Trevor puzzled over his meeting with General Campbell for several days. He was taking this windfall of goodwill at face value for the moment. He had no reason not to. As for the pirate logs, he immediately took them to VLC Security and one trusted outside agency, Vadok Investigations, for thorough examination. Normally, internal security would do a bang-up job, and will on this one, but he wanted an independent report to get more eyes on it, and in case it was needed for public scrutiny. He called over to the company's Space Operations Center to get a rundown on what satellite data they had or could attain, giving them information on the Northern Military Reserve. Any information could be useful. VLC had pretty good coverage of Mars, as they were still prospecting here. The logs revealed a gold mine of information from the start. These boys and girls had been quite busy. There was an attack on a Haruta metals convoy, as he had suspected. There were flare shots across the bow of each ship, warning them to stop. The video showed one ship, the Nakamura Maru, being boarded and likely taken. It looked like her entire crew were offloaded and transferred to the Tebe Maru along with provisions. The various videos showed what looked like every cargo container she had being ejected out of the primary loading bays of the Nakamura Maru, then being pulled one by one into the ships of the perpetrators. He thought he'd remembered something about the disappearance of the Nakamura Maru last year. He made a note to ping for Nico on that, painful as it might be. There appeared to be several instances of one or more of these ships shadowing commercial vessels to scout out the location of their mines or other operations. There were 3 other raids, it looked like, and the security had not gone through even a quarter of the logs. These were all exterior shots, it seemed. Whoever they were careful to keep the internal video off. This was only the first pass through the logs. Later, more careful analysis might reveal more clues. As for names and identification, the voice prints all appear to be altered. It was likely they all used fake names, even with each other. The navigation logs appeared to be intact and would be very useful. There's no mystery why they would not want to mess with those. He would have to be careful with them, as he did not want to be given that kind of advantage over his competition, tempting as it may be. The visual and transponder data, where they were turned on, would tell him who was being followed. Trevor left them to their work, but to alert him if there were any more logs, including JSO vessels. Already it looked like there were plenty of agenda items for the next Mars Frontier Council meeting. He made some notes and fired them off to the current chairman, Niles Thornton. They would be controversial issues, but the time had come to talk about them. Next month's meeting would be the election, so now was time to get things out on the table. The enterprises on the frontier, especially the fully private ones, were reluctant to speak publicly about their profits and losses or other trials. There were more appropriate places for that. The only ones who needed to be involved were the victims, the perpetrators, and their arbitrators. There were times when a widespread group approach was needed. No one had to say it aloud. The issues were usually large enough or had simmered long enough that spontaneous order would coalesce. A few people would just start solving the problem, and more people would join in. After a few generations out here, everyone knew that problems were resolved from the bottom up, not the top down. On the contrary, the worst disasters, like the Great Blight, were caused by top-down thinking, centralized planning, and the least qualified people with the greatest number of votes. Van Leeuwan received a call from the company's Space Operations Center regarding his request for data on the Northern Military Reservation. It was within the orbital paths of some of the satellites. They had pictures they could show him when he was ready. He arrived in their department right after lunch, and they began their review. The technicians spread out some photos on the conference table. Several were there just to represent the various building phases of the base, since it had been established almost 7 years ago. The progression in the overall size of the base and various surface structures could be seen plainly. Some were angled views and some were overhead. There was not much for man-made items until one looked at the base of Olympus Mons. There were tourist facilities on the surface, such as gondolas, of course, and the underground lava tube accommodations. There were the McKinney mass drivers of different sides of Olympus Mons, along with the McKinney Observatory facilities. Trevor was shown a handful of extreme enlargement photos of the base and buildings. The 3 pirate ships on individual pads could clearly be seen, as they are quite large. He asked if any more detailed photos were possible. If the satellites were repurposed, how much of a hassle would it be? He would like to get more than one view of each building, as well as the pads and support equipment around the pirate ships. That would be his wish list, or to get as close as possible. Pointing to a couple of photos, he asked the technicians if those were fuel and oxygen tanks not far from each pad. Did they think that each vessel could be refueled? He felt that the ships had not been disabled to the point where they could not get off the pads for a short flight over the surface. Even the craft with the bent-up aerospikes. Not all of the engines would be needed for a suborbital hop, only for braking from very high velocity. The kernel of a plan was formulating in his head. He had no idea if it would go anywhere, but he was going to get some better photos just in case. The technicians assured Van Leeuwan that some satellites could be repurposed, and he could have even more detailed images of the base and ships in 72 hours. The Michelson was still in orbit, but with a bent space bubble around it, which made detection quite difficult. Gravitational distortion of any radar beams aimed at her did not reflect properly, making the ship invisible for all intents and purposes. The bubble was at low power in a gravity-neutral shape, so the ship could orbit with little or no power. Van Leeuwan called the control center to find out what other new system vessels were available or could be available in the next week or so. Michelson was offline for routine and preventative maintenance. The Granville Woods would be here in 2 days, followed by the Linus Pauling the next day. All were sizable cargo haulers, and all had powerful gravity arrays. The 2 Sol system ships were needed. Actually only 1, but 2 gave a better comfort factor. The Huygens was available, as was the Jules Verne. He went through the rosters and looked up some potential leaders of the 5 flight crews he would need if we were to pull this off. He would be bringing them in one at a time to see how they felt about a special mission. He didn't want anyone tackling this one if they were not willing to take some personal risks, and that included their crews as well. After a few calls around the new settlements, Van Leeuwan felt he had taken an accurate temperature of the locals. He had been away for some time, but it looks like they had been stewing for most of it. They were ready for the Mars Frontier Council to get back into the swing of things. Many had been peppering Chairman Thornton with their agenda items along with his. Thornton was very organized and had done a good job collating their priorities. Though there were many subtopics and issues of great importance, the agenda could not go on forever. When Trevor received it, the following items were listed. Agenda, Mars Frontier Council, date, series, 14, 137. Chairman, Niles Thornton, meeting time, 7 p.m., Tuesday. Location, Heinlein Community Center, 121 Opportunity Street, Copernicus, New Settlements. Item 1, reading of the minutes of the previous meeting. Item 2, vote on acceptance of the minutes. 3, piracy. 4, abduction of new settlement crews. 5, tariffs on frontier goods and services. And 6, nominations for Mars Frontier Council elections. Chapter 17, Robert's Rules of Resistance. When Van Leeuwan arrived at the meeting, the venue was as packed as he had seen in years. He took his seat on the dais with the others on the executive committee. Niles looked at the clock, then his watch, and gavelled the meeting to order. It took a few minutes to get people to quiet down, but finally he could get started. Ladies and gentlemen, our secretary, Dinesh Mishra, will read the minutes from our last meeting. As Thornton nodded to Dinesh, he read off the minutes from the last meeting. There were 1 or 2 motions for minor corrections, and a motion was heard to accept them with those amendments. The motion was seconded. All those in favor of approving the minutes as amended from our last meeting, say aye. The PA system blared. There was a clear shouting for acceptance. All those not in favor of acceptance, say nay. There were no objections. The ayes have it. The minutes have been accepted, Thornton concluded. The next item on our agenda is piracy, Thornton stated. I have included only the word piracy here, as the issue is very broad, and we have not discussed it in some time. The purpose is for us to get as many of our ideas and feelings out there in order to shape it for a course of action. There was a buzz of murmurs from the crowd, and several hands shot up. The chair recognizes Ms. Ferniko Haruda, relayed Thornton. The Haruda family had been in shipping since the Edo shogunate. Some of her ancestors were pirates, to be truthful. Ferniko Haruda stood up straight and tall in her conservative but very attractive dress. She had taken over the business from her father when she was only 30 years old. She was 57 now, but barely showed it. Out of respect, the room went totally quiet. Ladies and gentlemen of the Mars Frontier Council, I know most of you here, and we have many more friends in the community. I know that we prefer to be stoic in the face of losses, But this piracy has grown to the point where we must no longer be silent. Lives have been lost in my family and yours over generations, just to find the resources we need to trade and survive. I feel the time for silence is over. Haruta Metals has been attacked several times, followed, spied on, and harassed. We lost to Nakamura Maru and her entire cargo by pirate predation. Fortunately, her crew was spared, but the incident was still traumatic for them. We have all seen the attempted piracy of a VLC ship recently, but Trevor could talk about this if he wishes. I would like to know if others are experiencing the same thing, and then I would like to explore ways of ending this evil once and for all. Thank you for your input, Miss Haruta, Thornton went on. Mr. Jurek Kowalczyk, you are recognized. Kowalczyk stood up to address the room. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My company, Frak Twersowski, only hauls between the Earth, Moon, and Mars, plus orbiting stations Deimos and Phobos. We, too, on our Earth-Mars runs, have been hijacked several times. It is useless to do anything but open the airlocks and let them in. Their weaponry is quite frightening. There aren't nearly enough Earth cruisers to cover that distance thoroughly, and we'd probably end up being prosecuted ourselves if we tried to fight back. Jurek bowed and sat down. The owner of Rio Grande Produce Distributors, Silverio Rodriguez, was recognized. I concur with what Mr. Kowalczyk is saying. I am not involved in the shipping business, but I am a major customer. My shipments have been taken several times by more than one hauler. Their insurance or mine might pay for much of it, but I am still without my product, and so are my customers here. I'm sure many of you have been disappointed when some dish you were looking for was not available. If something is seasonal, it makes things extra difficult and way more expensive. But that is nothing compared to the danger to the haulers. Thornton turned to Trevor. Mr. Van Leeuwan, do you wish to be recognized? From the daze, Trevor addressed the room. The investigations, our own investigations, of the Farnsworth incidents are ongoing, and I promise you we will not take 6 months doing it. We ourselves have been victims of this scourge for some time now. Like all of you, you recall in an attack on one of our ships, there was nothing left but the crew and the life pods. Of course, it was most important to preserve the crew, but clearly this cannot go on. We have not experienced the spying, but that is probably only a matter of time. Our crews are all personally armed now, and we've managed to discourage a few boarding incidents through surprise. We didn't have to shoot anyone, but the firepower was enough to discourage them. I believe that is why 3 ships were used on the Farnsworth. Nobody wants to try to get home when their ship is frightfully undermanned. One of the biggest unanswered questions regarding the Farnsworth was just what the heck those 2 JSO cruisers were doing there at just the right time in just the right place. I think we are going to find that many incidents we believe were pure happenstance are actually related in a bigger picture. Call me a conspiracy theorist if you like, Trevor smiled. But we should always look to connect the dots when our gut tells us they are there to connect. The chairman pointed to a younger woman in what looked like flight coveralls. Ms., do you wish to be recognized? She nodded and stood up. Mr. Van Leeuwan, do you think we should be arming cargo ships? An all-out space battle might just get everyone killed on both sides, wouldn't it? Our ships are not heavy enough to take extended fire, are they? Then she sat back down. Niles gestured to Trevor. Mr. Van Leeuwan, you may answer the question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, the thought of arming our ships has crossed my mind more than once. You see, I don't believe the attacks are being sponsored in the new settlements or anywhere on the frontier. I might be naive, but that's what I think. Now, as I said, in the last 6 months, our crews have been armed, and the incidents of harassment have dropped considerably. Our captains, as do yours, always warn the bandits that aggression cannot be tolerated. We generally get them to agree on record that compromise on aggression must not happen, and that those who pursue it must be punished. They don't believe we can punish them, so why not? This is the same policy that we practice in the new settlements, so why not take it with us? Most of us wear a weapon or two, and life is pretty peaceful for us compared to, say, Earth. As for arming our ships, VLC has done a fair amount of research on this, but never implemented it. And no, most cargo haulers out there do not have the armor to take a sustained attack. Ferniko Haruda raised her hand again and was recognized. Surely, Trevor, the abduction of your crew by the JSO was an act of aggression. How do we punish them? I see items 3 and 4 on tonight's agenda to be related. Both are crimes committed primarily against residents of the frontier, those working in the belt or those out in the vastness of space. My ancestors and yours have both dealt with these issues in the distant past. Was it not common for our ships to carry their own weapons like cannons, flintlocks, and swords? Were not those ships just as isolated in their day as ours are now? The Americans broke up the Muslim kidnappings and piracy that reigned in the Mediterranean Sea for hundreds of years, only because they got fed up. Everyone paid those thugs for years while 1 million Europeans were kidnapped and put into slavery. We certainly are not at that point, but there is a lot of hard work in the mines, and who better to do it than slaves for the unscrupulous? The young woman in the flight suit stood up again and waited to be recognized. Sarah Bailey here. I would like to know what those JSO cruisers were doing so close to the Farnsworth. That was some serious military hardware they were sporting, yet they didn't threaten the pirates at all. Who do they expect to be fighting way out there? What else is flying around out there that we don't know anything about? Shouldn't we be asking about their real purpose as if we get a straight answer? Anything beyond the nation's treaty compounds is supposed to be off limits to military craft. I guess that's not true in space, but it was certainly true for those APCs abducting the Farnsworth crew. An older gentleman with a distinguished white beard and white hair stood up. Thornton gestured to him and said, "Culloden McGregor, you are recognized." McGregor was semi-legendary on Mars. As a prospector, he had found almost anything there was to find, except the oil found by VLC. He found water, salt, iron, copper, sulfur, bauxite. The list was too long to repeat. He worked for himself and consulted for half a dozen other firms. He would spend weeks at a time in his self-designed, rolling habitat and laboratory. He had seen more of Mars up close than almost anyone living in the colonies. Culloden spoke. What you are really talking about, in a nutshell, is justice. I've been on Mars most of my life, and for all of that time, I've lived on the frontier. The people in the government enclaves don't understand us and don't respect us. They don't respect anyone, really, except the government hierarchy. We've lived on this knife edge for a century, especially in the few tubes that we share with them. I was surprised it took so long to have an incursion like the one with the Farnsworth crew, and I would go so far as to say that stealing your stuff is not the primary purpose of the pirates. The fifth item on the agenda is also related, said McGregor. There's always been a tariff. It might be 5% or 15%, but it has never been zero. The frontier doesn't charge a tariff because there's no one to collect it. We pay their tariffs, in their money, by the way, but what does it do for us? Nothing. We still make money selling them stuff, so we keep doing it, regardless of how they manipulate their currency. We don't really need to sell them stuff anymore, but they desperately need to buy it. We, too, get stuck in our ways of thinking, such as, that's the way it's always been, but it isn't the way it always has to be in the future. We could cause a lot of havoc by refusing to pay their tariff in their worthless currency, or just selling them less stuff. People forget that their laws don't apply to us, regardless of what they would have you believe. It's all about respect, folks. Respect and justice when you don't get it. We have to get them to agree that we need mutual respect and truly impartial justice. It goes without saying that the first thing the Farnsworth crew did was transmit their charter of negative rights to those pirates, as we all do. But do they respect it? No. Niles noticed that Ferniko had raised her hand once more. Ms. Haruda, you are recognized. She stood up and straightened her dress once more. Mr. McGregor has thought this out and made some very good points, as usual. Rhenium, iridium, rhodium, osmium, all were once much more precious than they are now, though we still do pretty well. We make those materials cheaper, and we can see what some very creative people have done with them on Mars and Earth both. Without us, they might never have had that opportunity, an opportunity that benefited the whole society. We pay those ridiculous tariffs to the skimmers, and for what purpose? So they can hire more customs officials to collect even more money? I believe we need to signal our discontent by making a statement. I would like to start by demanding an apology for the abduction of the Farnsworth crew, along with compensation to the families and to VLC for any and all inconveniences, plus some punitive damages to be paid to charities in the new settlements. The chairman interjected. The chair will recognize himself. Ms. Haruta, did you have something in particular in mind as a way of enforcing this request? I think what you're asking is modest and fair, but we've never demanded anything like this before. I yield the rest of my time to Ms. Haruta. Standing up again, Ms. Haruta said, Thank you, Chairman. Yes, what I have in mind is this. Once we decide on the package of compensation, we formally present it to the governor of the nation's treaty enclaves with a deadline for delivery. We can give them 1 week to pony up, as the Americans say. Or if they refuse outright from the beginning, we begin sanctions. What I propose for sanctions is that we stop serving government employees in our new settlement businesses. We deliver on current contracts to individuals and governments, but we put a hold on all future negotiations until this simple request is granted. There was a murmuring, then a clamor in the hall. Chairman Thornton gavelled the meeting back to order. Order, order. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone will have a chance to speak. Miss Sarah Bailey, you are recognized. Sarah stood up and looked around nervously before she started. I like the sound of what Miss Haruta is saying, but won't that be a problem for a lot of people? My sister runs a restaurant, and something like that could cut into her budget a bit too much. Her margins are pretty tight. Sarah saw that Trevor had a sympathetic look. I would like to yield my time to Mr. Van Leeuwan, please. Trevor said, Thank you, Miss Bailey, but we understand completely. If you and your sister are new to the settlements, you might not be terribly familiar with our history. We know the way things are taught back on Earth is distorted. They don't tell you that we've developed a voluntary culture here. In the popular culture, they will display us like Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Other than Mr. McGregor here, is there anyone who looks like Buffalo Bill? Several people, including Culloden McGregor, gave a good laugh. We can institute a plan, such as Ms. Haruta is suggesting, with only voluntary compliance, continued Trevor. The purpose of meetings like this is to explore what the consensus is. If we feel there is enough there to catch fire, then we go ahead. If your sister can't risk turning away customers, then that's fine, but she could put up a sign of support or some other show of solidarity, or do nothing at all. We understand. But we also understand, in the spirit of Samuel Adams, that a critical mass of folks taking action like this can nullify a lot of bad behavior. There might be a few people who will try to guilt-trip your sister or make some snide remarks, but by and large, not everyone can take part in every action. We have better things to do than force our utopias on our neighbors. So be of good cheer. Fernico stood up again and was recognized. I move that Mr. Van Leeuwan propose a compensation package for his company employees and their families. Culloden McGregor seconded the motion, and Thornton called for a vote. All in favor of Mr. Van Leeuwan proposing a compensation package for VLC, his employees, and families, say aye. The vote was overwhelmingly in favor. Trevor, being recognized, said, I already have a detailed listing of the company and employee damages prepared, and I move that Ms. Haruta propose a package for punitive damages. The vote for Ms. Haruta to identify the punitive damages was also voted for by a large margin. Ms. Haruta, who was very connected with the frontier charities, did not take long to come up with something the group could vote on before they adjourned. She had several in mind, but settled on 250 troy ounces of rhodium for the Magellan Society and 900 troy ounces of palladium for the Addiction Treatment Center. The Magellan Society was looking for a cure for a syndrome caused by bacteria discovered in the Magellan's chasma. She put these damages forward in a motion. The motion was put forward to vote on the sanctions as a combination. Silverio Rodriguez proposed an amendment. I would love to support your sanctions, but I believe many others would as well if we could limit them to Mars and the frontier, leaving out Earth and the Moon. They are probably involved, but if we limit our scope to this violation, primarily perpetrated on the locals, then participation would be higher. No one wants to wipe out their business by boycotting the entire Earth-Moon system, and we should still have a huge impact. Thornton nodded. All in favor of Mr. Rodriguez's motion, please say aye. A loud aye reverberated through the room. The ayes have it. We now have a motion with Mr. Rodriguez's limitations for sanctions. Do we have a second? Offered Niles. I second the motion, said an excited Sarah Bailey. All in favor of the sanctions, as displayed on the main server, say aye. The vote for sanctions was nearly unanimous. The ayes have it, said Thornton. Do we have any further discussion on the previous agenda items? Once? Twice? All right. Now let's open the nominations for Mars Frontier Council offices to be voted on next session. In turn, motions were put forward to nominate various people for the various lower offices. Finally, the office of chairman came up. Culloden McGregor's name was put forward and seconded, mostly out of respect. Everyone knew he spent too much time out in the field to tend to such things. They were lucky he was here today, because he always added something to the mix. Fernico stood. I nominate Trevor Van Leeuwan to be the next chairman of the Mars Frontier Council. There was loud cheering as Thornton gavelled him quiet. Do we have a second? I second the motion, shouted Sarah Bailey. Very well, shouted Thornton. Do we have a motion to adjourn? I second the motion, said Trevor. All in favor of adjourning this meeting, say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. This meeting of the Mars Frontier Council is now adjourned. The next day, Chairman Thornton put out a "to whom it may concern" communique to the news nets and media, such as it was. He knew it would be picked up in a hurry by every outlet known to man on this planet and back on Earth. No government employee from the governor on down would be a welcome customer in the new settlements, establishments, or their suppliers. They would not be served if they were identified as being government workers, whether they were clerks, mailmen, cops, soldiers, politicians, or their staffs, until the demands were satisfactorily met. The new Frontier Council did not identify a specific entity as the payer in the dispute, other than the JSO who were actually holding the crew. A number of arbitration senators were identified that were amenable to settling the dispute, holding the funds in escrow until all conditions had been met. This caused a stir throughout the entire occupied solar system. As intended, no one had ever thought the bullies could be countered in such a way, and the debates raged. Chapter 18. When they least expect it. Trevor would let things percolate in the new settlements for a while. He started calling in his crew captains to go over his proposal for even greater justice. For each one, he showed them some of the new photos from the company's Space Operations Center. They had outdone themselves, repurposing the VLC satellites. These images were much sharper and offered some new angles not seen in the old ones. They went a bit farther in verifying his suspicions about the pirates. The interview sessions were almost identical with each captain he brought in. First, they had to come to grips that there was a military base in the middle of nowhere. Then each of them recognized the three ships sitting on the various pads. They had all gone over the log data so many times that these vessels were lodged deep in their memories. If other outfits had better video, they never shared it. Perhaps now they would. Different time-lapse sequences were put together with the images and video. There were people walking around in non-military pressure suits, some of them up on top of the ships or in the temporary pressure tents attached to the outside of the vessels. It looked like they were doing routine maintenance and getting a start on some major repairs that they could do at this facility. It appeared there was only one hangar where major work could be done under normal atmospheric conditions. One of his pilots said, "One thing looks clear, sir. None of those guys look like prisoners, and they certainly don't act like prisoners." Trevor said, "No, they don't, do they? So what's your guess?" He looked serious as a heart attack. Sir, to me those look like mercenaries. Van Leeuwan said, that's my impression, exactly. Then Van Leeuwan came out and said what most of them were thinking. I want to bring these guys in to the new settlements and try them there. Of course, each captain's eyes lit up because they hated these SOBs, endangering their crews. Then the reality hit them, just how dangerous this was against trained thugs, plus the possible repercussions among the nation's treaty signatories or the JSO. Van Leeuwan explained what he wanted the crews for, primarily, was to get everyone in and out. Not only did he want the pirate crews, he wanted their vessels as well. He would have security teams make the actual raids and round up the crews. 2 ships with 5 crews, plus the security teams would go in. He needed the captains to work with the security teams to plan their individual assaults on the ships, because they were not all the same design. The captains would know the best way to get in and out in any possible ways they might be taken by surprise from any unknown hiding places. So they needed to study any information the company could pull together on these designs, as well as use their experience and intuition. The best situation, naturally, would be for a couple of experienced cargo runners to go in with the assault teams. He needed 4 crews to fuel up the pirate ships, top off their own, and get them ready. Then all 5 ships would fly out. He already knew one man who would volunteer to be at the tip of the spear, Dove Gutenberg. Each captain went back to his crew and laid out the plan. No one hesitated. They were all in. Dove Gutenberg rounded up the people he needed to go in with the security teams. He would take one and Trevor would take one. They pored over the photos for the next 2 days, went through their databases and confirmed what Trevor had thought from the beginning. These were ships of known types, though heavily modified to do their dirty business. They had gun turrets, grappling hooks, heavy-duty robotic arms, anything else one might need for boarding, grabbing, drilling, or cutting into other ships. The crews knew how to override the locks, and if that didn't work, what were the best ways to force entry without damaging the flight characteristics of each vessel. From the flyover images, it looked like the pirates were living aboard their ships, which made sense. There probably were not many attractions at the base that they did not already have. JSO personnel were far more likely to be aboard the pirate ships because there were more distractions. If a few of those could be captured, even better. Most ships flying out of Mars stayed on Mars Coordinated Time, MCT. From what could be seen, these guys were staying on that schedule. It made sense if your prey was doing the same thing, and that could be used to advantage. The more of them caught sleeping or eating, the easier things would go. The cargo ship crews usually had ground support to get their rigs fueled and ready to fly. They were all trained to do it in the past, if only to make them appreciate everything it took to make these vessels move. For this mission, they needed to be fast, so they needed to train. In case they needed to go to orbit, Van Leeuwan would make sure, when the time came, that there were some fuel ships waiting. At the same time, the security teams needed to practice up and try different scenarios. To stay out of sight and to make the best of everyone's training time, they moved their practice runs out to the VLC oil field site. There were many different types of ships going in and out of there, and they could practice on several different basic designs in a short time. The regular crews were good sports and really enjoyed watching videos of their ships being stormed by armed troops. Quite a few of them volunteered to play pirates. Van Leeuwan made the long drive out to VLC oil field number 1 to do some routine checking on operations in addition to going over some final details of the operation. They had sped down the road, seeing sections of pipeline already up and depots of sections ready to be put together. As they rounded the bend, he could see the oil field ahead. There were several good wells, capped and ready to gush forth their product. Several huge storage tanks were ready, and work on the refinery was in full swing. Looking back to the valley walls, he could see the alluvial plains spreading out from the walls. Many of them were covered in lichens or the varied colors of bacteria colonies. Here and there were dots of small pine trees, the type that grow at very high altitudes on Earth. Satellite images showed security to be a bit lax near the targeted vessels. Perhaps the JSO expected the crews to organize their own watches and procedures. Most of all, it was because very few Mars colonists even knew of this base. The crews had maybe 2 men on watch maximum per ship. The JSO did not have many of their own people near the pads. Most of them were at posts just inside the buildings, or at pickets around the military reserve as a whole. There was no one walking the perimeter, only robots and multiple cameras run by low-level artificial intelligence. It was thought actual guards ready to move out into the field were ready wearing their pressure suits, sitting close to an exit. If they were called up, they needed to put their helmets on, grab their rifles, and scramble out of the airlocks. If they were not suited up, it would take them even more time to assemble. Van Leeuwan felt there was a good stretch of no man's land between the guard details and the ships. He would take advantage of it when the time came. The Michelson, the Granville Woods, and the Musk were all in orbit about Mars. The captains and crews had all been briefed on the mission and had been running their own scenarios with each other. Each took up their position above but outside the Mars Northern Military Reservation. Only a very faint glow could be seen surrounding them, as there was almost no atmosphere to ionize. This was a tricky operation for Trevor. Very few of those going in on the ground were privy to VLC's advanced technologies, or their cousins living in another solar system entirely. The flight crews, save for a few captains and first officers, and the security teams, were going to have comrades they knew nothing about, helping them on this one. The most important thing here was that nobody got hurt, either the VLC teams or the bad guys. If those monitoring the skies at 3:30 a.m. MCT or the vast plains around the reservation had been paying full attention, it is still unlikely they could have seen the 2 VLC ships coming, or if they did, their reaction time would not have mattered. After launching themselves into a ballistic arc toward the military reserve, the Jules Verne and the Arthur C. Clarke dropped out of the sky like 2 falcons diving on their kills. From a fuel and energy perspective, it makes no sense to fire braking engines until right before they are needed. In the thin broth of CO2 Mars called atmosphere, there was no sound to speak of. The vessels came to rest on pads adjacent to those of the pirate ships. Before anyone knew it, VLC security teams and their cargo crew pathfinders were scrambling out of the bellies of the 2 commercial ships, heading for the 3 pirate ships. No more than 1 or 2 crewmen were on watch for any pirate ship, and any inside pressure tents were quickly neutralized. VLC teams walked right into 1 ship, but had to bypass the airlock closures on the other 2. Each security team separated, sending 1 group toward the bridge and another toward the crew quarters. Rolling a stun grenade into the crew quarters was enough to round up most of them. They were quickly zip-tied and marched off to the recreation rooms. Here and there were the sounds of screams as they were tased, or one could see them flipping around on the floor while being zip-tied. Outside, the Arthur C. Clarke and the Jules Verne crews were moving vehicles and hose booms to the intakes of their ships first. If everything went to hell, they were all going to go out the way they came in. They were all armed, just in case, but none of them liked the idea of shooting going on near so much fuel. It wasn't likely that there would be an explosion like on Earth, but pools of liquid oxygen on metal where sparks were flying was not a joke. Methane and liquid oxygen were flowing to the Clarke and the Jules Verne, so they moved on to the pirate ships. Lights were going on in buildings inside the compound. Floodlights were moving this way and that, looking for whatever was different. They settled on the 2 new ships in the yard and those fueling them up. More lights were fully illuminating the pirate ships and those moving equipment up to their fuel and liquid oxygen ports. The gauges read empty on the pirate ships, of course. The only liquids and gases in them were there to keep the tanks cold and pressurized. If they had to fuel them up warm, there would have been no hope. Most of the liquid oxygen or liquid nitrogen would be boiled off, trying to get them cold enough for a liquid phase to form. In the distance, near a couple of buildings, it looked like people in pressure suits were coming out of the buildings and forming up. All of them were armed with what looked like conventional but powerful rifles. Through binoculars, the fuel crews could see the hand signals and the squads intensely listening to orders as they fanned out toward each of the vessels on the pads. The captains of the Michelson, Granville Woods, and Musk were coordinating with each other. Brigida Lati, aboard the Michelson, was in charge of air support for this mission. Inside Pirate 1, Trevor had gotten isolated and subsequently jumped by what looked like the first mate. They were dressed in some clownish paramilitary uniforms that made them look like brown shirts. There was no time for fashion because the dude had his arm around Trevor's neck while he was reaching for anything he could use as a weapon, a pencil or a piece of broken glass. He didn't care, really. The leader of the security team heard the commotion in the cabin and ran back to find them rolling on the floor. He waited for his moment, then tased the guy good until he was unable to hold on to anything. He tossed Trevor some zip ties, and he worked quickly to truss him up. In Pirate 3, Dove Gutenberg was guiding the leader of the security team toward the bridge and scanning for crewmen. They had captured 9 out of the possible complement of 14 on this ship, though they would not know how many were actually aboard until they could read the logs on the bridge. He spied someone slipping into the elevator and shot through the closing doors after him. He took a couple of shots to the jaw and one to the gut before the security team got the doors open. 2 more jumped on him and held him down and flipped him over on his face while they zip-tied him. Dove got up, rubbing his face and his neck. "Hey, that was fun, guys. Can we do it again?" When they got to the bridge, they found out there was only one more crewman assigned to the ship, a gunnery sergeant who had separate quarters near the ammunition storage. When the team came together again, the gunnery man was barricaded inside his quarters. Dove asked the team leader if he had any gas, to which the reply was yes. Dove then guided them down the hall, 2 doors to another room, where there was access to a ventilation duct. Silently, he pointed up to the duct while he removed the grill. The security man motioned for his men to line each side of the door as he prepared to gas, and they put their masks on. It was a slick little number for small spaces about the size of a short cigar. Pressing a button on the end, he rapidly slid it down the shaft toward the sergeant's room. Dove tossed him a seat cushion to cover up the shaft at his end. Shots went off, with some going through the door of the room, but no one was right in front of it. When the guy busted out, he came coughing through a cloud of tear gas and was tackled immediately. Dove hit another switch, and the gas moved backward into the room until it was gone, vanishing through the scrubbers. From the point of view of the flight crews doing the refueling, it looked like there would not be nearly enough time. They decided to leave the fuel and LOX lines in place on all of the ships and beat feet to where they needed to be. They would keep a watch on the ground troops and do an emergency release from inside at takeoff so they could keep refueling to the last minute. If it was not enough, the computers would take them to an alternate landing site. Getting the ships ready for takeoff was top priority. Monitoring the movements of the troops had to be secondary. All armaments on the pirate ships were locked down, and they didn't see any heavy artillery on the base. They crossed their fingers they would not see any. Pilots and engineers were doing the calculations in their heads, as well as punching numbers into the computers, counting the number of crew, troops, and prisoners they were hauling. They computed how much fuel and burn time they would need to make the hop and land where they wanted to land. Aboard the Michelson, Brigida Lati was watching as the ship's crews scrambled to their respective vessels. All were checking in with Van Leeuwan while she listened in. One security team was divided and on board each of the VLC vessels to make sure the prisoners stayed put. All 5 ships had their respective crews in place or were in final boarding, with the more expert members on board the pirate ships. One never knew what kind of modifications were made to such vessels, so the most experienced crewmen were there to troubleshoot. The foot soldiers had gotten underway and were running all out toward each of the spacecraft. Then Brigida gave the order to the Granville Woods and the Musk to engage their gravity arrays. This they did in a wide, continuous, slightly elliptical band around the 5 ships in the no man's land between the landing pads and buildings of the Northern Military Reserve. Everything in the donut of positive gravitational interference became 6 times as heavy as it was a few seconds ago. Men running across it slumped to the ground instantly. Automatic weapons fired tracers which could be seen bending slightly downward for no apparent reason, like laser beams refracted in a tank of water. Bullets fired across it fell to the ground faster and far shorter than planned, so no one could figure out how to aim. Brigida told Trevor that the field was in place. They could fuel a little while longer as they were watching from above. If all else failed, they could jiggle the field amplitude to mess with their aim even more. The interior of the elliptical barrier was not altered appreciably by the gravity arrays. Space bent there nearly the way it had since the planet was formed. Systems aboard the Jules Verne and the Arthur C. Clarke were nominal. Reading proper fuel levels, the computer commanded powerful solenoids to engage the emergency releases on the fuel and liquid oxygen lines. Hose connections were blown after valves on both sides of the connection were closed. The booms moved out and away from the ships automatically as designed. Trevor was still on Pirate Ship 1. He was no Tom Cruise, but he wasn't going to avoid any of the risks he had asked his people to attempt. He knew those pirates were not going to get away this time. He had told the captains of the VLC ships that they were to get away as soon as possible. He wanted those pirates in custody, and he did not want to lose more ships. On the monitors, he saw 3 APCs booking across the hard Martian regolith. These each had a launcher mounted on top with 6 or 8 missiles. It was a long ways away, and he was no expert on weaponry. As the APCs sped forward, their missile launchers appeared to be tracking on the 2 ships ready for takeoff. Brigida gave the order to shrink the gravity wall to one that protected only the vessels that were still refueling, but do it only after the first 2 ships had cleared the pads by 10 meters or so. She wanted the spare power shifted to the grid arrays. They would free up if the gravity wall strength was at a constant. 2 missiles were already away from 1 APC, headed for the Arthur C. Clarke. The missiles had thrust vectoring since the aerodynamics of Mars left little for control. The 2 missiles were tracking an image of the Arthur C. Clarke lodged in a memory chip somewhere, while the new images were continuously compared from all angles. As the missiles went through the gravity wall, they were deflected downward sharply. Their brains told them in nanoseconds to vector up sharply, or they would not complete their programming. This they did, but overcompensated ever so slightly to shoot up and over a midship of the Clarke, then continued out into the vast Martian desert to explode there in silence. Main engine start was nearly simultaneous for the 2 VLC craft. Thrust built up under each of them, and they slowly lifted off. As the feedback from the first 2 missiles reached the networked APCs, their artificial brains pondered together why they had not hit their target. Mixed with the data from each set of tracking sensors, new paths were calculated to achieve a more desirable result. The second APC fired 2 missiles toward the Jules Verne, but as the ships had not gained enough altitude, the wall was still in place. The missiles traversed the gravity wall, being deflected down only slightly this time, as compensation took over sooner. Passing through the wall, the 2 missiles were well on their way when they were slammed by a gravity bubble from the Musk, which lifted and separated them into a harmless Y pattern past the Jules Verne. 2 more missiles from the first APC followed almost immediately, but took the low road. One of the landing legs of the Arthur C. Clarke was clipped and damaged, but the missiles did not explode. They only deflected downward, slightly hitting a tanker truck full of liquid oxygen 200 meters away, where they did explode. The tanker was destroyed mostly from the impact, but burned briefly white hot before the oxygen dissipated enough to extinguish it. Before the targets could be reacquired, the company's ships were accelerating rapidly out of range. Trevor, Dove, and the rest of the crews were sweating it out, wondering if they would snatch enough fuel and oxidizer to get these crates off the surface. The engineers were calling out the fuel levels since everyone had an idea what they had to be for them to get away. They wondered why no missiles were hitting them yet. Two of the APC drivers instinctively stopped before they hit the wall, or rather, where they saw the first of the infantry pinned to the ground. The third driver had gone too far and was sunk into the Martian sand, spinning his wheels. Breathing heavily inside was the driver, gunner, and more support troops. The infantry in the back were all pasted to the floor. The driver was pinned to his seat, as was the gunner. They could move slightly, but with great difficulty. Using voice commands, the driver geared down the APC. He redistributed power among the 6 wheels and managed to get her to move toward the 3 remaining ships. He told the gunner to use his voice commands as well and see what he could do. Brigida warned Trevor that they could only contract the wall another 20 meters or so without affecting the pirate ships. After that, if the APC broke through, they would have to target a bubble at the APC to try to discourage her further. Even then, they should not try that if the target were too close to his ships that were still refueling. Another 10 meters, 5 meters, and finally the APC punched through. Brigida had to admire their dedication, if not their motives. Everyone inside the personnel carrier took a big breath of air. It felt like they had had the wind knocked out of them. The driver and gunner regained their composure somewhat and focused on a plan. The sergeant driving the vehicle did not want to miss. He was going to give his gunner a shot point blank at the closest ship to them, Pirate 1. When the other APC drivers saw that one could get through whatever barrier this was, they checked with the first driver. Bracing themselves, they resumed their mission toward the other 2 ships and pushed into the wall. Aboard the Michelson, Brigida's first officer told her their sensors detected the laser ranging and targeting from the closest APC as it shined its dot on the bridge of the vessel in front of it. She told herself she had to risk it and ordered her first officer to take out the APC. The first officer pressed the virtual button, and a bubble formed around the carrier, flipping it end over end, landing upside down on top of the missile battery. Momentarily stunned, the driver, gunner, and troops inside hung for a few seconds upside down in their seat belts. More pissed off than shocked, one by one they extracted themselves and pushed out the rear hatch. They formed up again a few yards in front of their vehicle, with a couple of them breaking out their rocket-propelled grenades. Still listening to the fuel level announcements, Trevor could hear the ping of automatic weapons fire ringing over the hull. He desperately hoped they were not hitting anything vital. The first officer was eyeing all of the alarms to take action at the first sign of trouble. On a nearby viewer, he was watching as the squad outside leveled their RPGs and what looked like a gnarly anti-tank weapon at them. Whoever they were, these guys were hardcore. What could they be possibly expecting out here in the middle of nowhere to be so armed to the teeth? The engineer said, "We've got enough fuel to get to the drill site, but I'd really love some insurance." Van Leeuwan asked Brigida what she could do, but she was already on it. She sent a beam down to flatten the squad threatening to do the most harm. As their muscles tensed again, the 2 men with the RPGs fired them both. They were down so fast that the grenades just skated and skipped across the ground underneath Pirate 1 and out into the red sand beyond. The squad commander and the APC driver were thrown over on their backs this time and lay there staring straight up into the sky, wondering what the hell was happening to them, each afraid to ask the other. They thought they could make out the very faintest outline of what looked like 2 or 3 craft directly overhead. In rapid succession, all ships verified they had the proper fuel and oxygen levels, plus the reserves they needed to get out of there. The ships were not 100%, but they could fly. They didn't have to fly far, but they had to land in one piece. Orders were given to blow the emergency releases on the fuel lines. Shortly thereafter, the captains shouted for engine start. Navigation programs had long ago been entered and verified. The massive engine banks of all 3 ships ignited, and they rose silently into the air. The gravity press holding the forward squad down had been lifted, and they all scrambled for the safety of the APC as a pressure wave of steam and CO2 shot out in their direction. The gravity wall was turned off, but the men and women just lay there recovering or staying low for the takeoff. The JSO infantry slowly got up and pulled the rest with them. The forward squad worked their way out of their APC again. Everyone was covered in Martian dust and staring into the sky as they watched the fires of their 3 ships get smaller and smaller in the heavens. Radar would track them as far as it could, with the heading information relayed to other bases capable of picking up their trajectories. They would have to hope for decent satellite data if they wanted to find them. Coverage of Mars was nothing like that of Earth. There were global positioning systems, but radar and tracking had large gaps. The forward squad was picked up by the other APCs, and they squeezed in for the short trip back to the barracks. Commander Kynaston was beside himself as he watched the defeated infantry marching back to their barracks. This was not going to look good on his record, even though he was not directly in command of the military wing here. How was he going to explain the logs showing a bunch of grown men and women lying down in the red Martian sand instead of advancing? He did, after all, have some say in picking these units. How was he going to explain how a band of unknown cargo haulers bested and absconded with his mercenary units? The 3 pirate ships were on a ballistic heading for the Valles Marineris to landing pads near the edge of the drill site, but a bit more private. Everyone was buckled in, hoping that the pirates hadn't gotten too cute with the basic function of their ship. It was still early morning here, and there had been a recent dust storm, so visibility was affected. Navigation computers were in control and set each vessel down gently on their pre-programmed individual pads. There were cargoes coming in at all hours, so no one really gave them a second look. They were too far away to really see the heavy damage on Pirate 3, and certainly not the remaining damaged aerospikes on Pirate 1. At the end of each pad, a slot opened in the concrete as a stack of metal and canvas slowly rose to the surface. Once the stack had reached the top, the front edge of the stack began to move forward, and the metal supports separated. Between each metal support, which arched high over the top of each cargo ship, there was a fabric section connecting them. These light hanger assemblies stretched out along rails until they were fully extended and bolted to a solid wall at the opposite end. These were quite often used to shield ships from the incessant dust on Mars that eventually found its way into everything. In this case, however, the tents doubled as shields to impede the curious. Trevor, Dove, and the rest of the crewmen, all in pressure suits, climbed down out of their captured prizes and started high-fiving each other, yelling over their helmet comms, and slapping each other on the back as they walked toward the building they had commandeered for training. Dove laughed loudly and said, "Trevor, do you think they are still scratching their heads back there while their officers chew them out?" As they changed out of their pressure suits, Van Leeuwan replied, "We can only hope so. I have to admit, I was sweating pretty hard when I heard that machine gun fire ricocheting off the hull. But right now, they are wondering just what or who hit them. They are embarrassed and extremely pissed off, you can bet." One of the men looked more thoughtful. "Do you think they would track us here, Mr. Van Leeuwan?" "I think they will narrow it down, but I doubt they'll be sure enough to come in here. That's one reason why I wanted to bring the ships here. This canyon is extremely deep, and those ships are essentially right next to the wall. The satellite would have to be directly overhead to see them, and those spacecraft are covered up. I have a good expectation that only people we trust will ever get near them here." Van Leeuwan had a large catered breakfast for the men, both at drill site number 1 and back at VLC Millikan Center, where the Arthur C. Clarke and Jules Verne had landed. There were pancakes, eggs, waffles, French toast, sausages, bacon, every kind of syrup, fruit, juices, special coffees brought in from Santa Barbara. You name it, and it was there. He even fed the mercenaries the same food in detention, for which they were grateful. Addressing his people in both locations, except for the prisoners, Trevor told him he wanted everyone to have a few days off, even the mercenaries. Their stay would be in separate cells so they could not corroborate their stories. In the meantime, he would have his engineers and investigators alongside an independent entity go over these ships with a fine-tooth comb. In a couple of days, security would start questioning the accused pirates, depending on what preliminary evidence was found. There was enough to hold them, certainly. They were living on these ships, which had threatened the Philo T. Farnsworth and her crew. From the way the rooms looked, the pirates had occupied them for some time. In the end, Van Leeuwan said, "Thank you again to all of you ladies and gentlemen for the fine job you did this morning. You were all very cool under fire. No one was seriously hurt, and we made a huge statement, which will be heard by everybody in due time." Chapter 19. The Martians are restless. Back in the new settlements, spirits were high. Since the last Mars Frontier Council meeting and ultimatum, there was a renewed sense of pride on the frontier. No one wanted to lose that sense of purpose they came out here to claim. No one was going to stand for being disrespected by people who had never made anything, thought of anything new, or worked hard at anything except extortion. Most of the larger companies were encouraging their employees to frequent the small businesses, or they were contracting with them themselves for catering or concierge services to make up for their loss of customers. Sarah Bailey's sister decided to take part, and she had new lunch and dinner crowds from other frontier businesses. She posted a sign in her restaurant stating her support for the boycott. No one in the new settlements lost any serious business, as Culloden McGregor had predicted. The frontier had always been very self-supportive. If they had not been that way, many more would have died. The big boys did not get big by taking government subsidies and or writing rules that smaller businesses were forced to implement or go bankrupt by implementing them. The people who really thought they were suffering were the government workers, politicians, and all of those on the do not serve list. Everyone knew that the best stores, restaurants, theaters, or any other good or service was better in the new settlements. There were several notable exceptions in the government enclaves, but those were completely swamped. One could not get a reservation, get one's vehicle serviced, home repairs, or anything at all without waiting in long lines or praying for an appointment to open up. Businesses in that sector and their employees were loving it, so they were not going to complain, and those were their constituents. The shops and restaurants were making money hand over fist. Their employees were getting double overtime and huge tips, so if anything, tax revenues were going up, even though the hierarchy was nearly in tears. Where were they going to go for their 3 martini lunches? Where were they going to practice their golf swings? The official response, of course, was silence. No one was going to admit any kind of responsibility or wrongdoing for ordering the kidnapping of the Farnsworth crew. Instead, they issued subpoenas for them to appear in front of one of their committees. The media blitz continued as predicted. Politicians and pundits claimed that the Farnsworth crew had a civic duty to answer any and all questions put to them by their investigators. Token freedom advocates, in their panel discussions, asserted there were no citizens in this crew and thus had no obligation to cooperate. These were basic rights that a 6-year-old could explain, that people cannot be grabbed off the street or out of their vehicles when there is no indication of wrongdoing, no indication that they had victimized anyone. The negative rights of the crew were violated by the JSO and their miners as much as the pirates intended to violate them. The states and their bastard children, such as the JSO, would say that rights claimed to be people's rights, sometimes the states, were violated, and they were acting for the victims. Never mind that the judge and the prosecutor claimed to be representing the same entity. Actually, the state was asserting positive rights and claiming the Farnsworth crew had violated them. The state assumed that the Farnsworth crew must do whatever the state told them to do, regardless of their own individual right to remain silent. Residents of the frontier did not believe in these government mala prohibita (because we say so) claims. When the various miners' associations brought up the desire to be paid for their valuable product and some equally valuable commodities, it really rattled some cages in the government enclaves. Other groups were asking why they needed government permits to sell their goods and services, or why they should pay tariffs. Such monies were never spent in the new settlements. They were already paying for their own security, insurance, bonding, and arbitration forums, and saw no need to use an inferior product. It was well known that service was better, grades were higher, while schools were tougher, crime was lower, and the pathways were cleaner in the new settlements. People were not harassed for code violations toward the end of the month when the state needed revenues. Governor Fabrizio Schiari was the current rotating head man for the Mars government enclaves. For the majority of government climbers, it was an easy one Martian year stint, consisting of paperwork and parties. The staffers did all the work anyway. Just another 6 months and he was quietly back in the rotation, or onto his next gig. So he didn't need this headache. He didn't need politicians on Mars, the moon, or back on Earth calling him constantly, wondering why he was not keeping order. No one understands government less than politicians, he thought to himself. He was one of them, so he knew that it was absolutely and absurdly true. If it were not, then why were they all shadowed 2 people deep in lawyers? None of them understood that he was not the governor of Mars. He was only the governor of some enlarged network of lava tubes, only on a committee where the tubes shared space with the new settlements and had no real power beyond that. People kept telling him he had to put his foot down and enforce the law on those in the new settlements, especially in villages like Copernicus and Leibniz. They thought there was some kind of rebellion going on. He kept telling them there was nothing in the charter giving him the power to do anything. Van Leeuwan had better things to do than to come babysit this clown Schiari, but there was an off chance that this was an overture to end a disagreement barely a week old. "Mr. Van Leeuwan, come in, come in. It's a pleasure to see you." As Trevor came in, the governor motioned him toward a sofa in the sitting area of his spacious office overlooking a park. The artificial lighting entering through these large windows was bright and very sun-like today. The nuclear reactors at the surface of the frontier zone must be radiating nicely. As they made themselves comfortable, a woman with a bun in a white, tight-fitting jacket brought in a large silver tray filled with various fruits, crackers, cheeses, and other items to snack on. Iced tea, lemonade, and other drinks were already on the table. "So, Mr. Van Leeuwan, I trust you are settling in nicely to Mars after your long absence?" Trevor was trying to decide if Schiari was just making small talk or being sarcastic. He decided to take the high road. "No problems there, Governor. I'm getting in touch with a lot of old friends and making new ones. There's going to be a boom here, you can bet on it. There's another 10 square miles of lava tubes being sealed off as we speak. And they are not coming to live in my sector," was all the governor could think. Tax revenues have been going down for years because people kept leaving the settlements. If it kept up, he would be the first human leader with a skid row on another planet. Trying to force a smile, Schiari said, "That's just wonderful, isn't it? As we say in Italy, the rising tide, she lifts all of the gondolas, no?" Mating some different colored cheeses with more of his crackers, Trevor said, "I like that, Governor. Perhaps I could use it in the future. The water is a scarce commodity in liquid form around here. Say, I've never received a call from the governor's office in all the years I've been coming to Mars, though perhaps my predecessors have." The governor thought for a moment about a possible opening. Yes, your famous ancestor, Marcus Aurelius Van Leeuwan, the one named after a famous Italian, was an astronaut, I believe. Trevor didn't really see the connection, but continued. "Well, I guess so. Grandpa Marcus was not an astronaut, but he was quite an inventor and innovator. He had a hand in building many spacecraft in the early times. He formed the first extraterrestrial housing development not far from where we are now. Since that time, I'm afraid contact has been rather sporadic. Well, be that as it may, Mr. Van Leeuwan, we are all humans embarked on this fantastic voyage of discovery, are we not? Just like Christopher Columbus. We must embrace this journey in the bonds of brotherhood." Van Leeuwan sat back and took a long drink of his lemonade. Fabrizio, if I may call you that, the bonds of brotherhood, I do like the sound of that also. But didn't Columbus offer a prize to the first man who spotted the New World? And didn't he take credit for that himself and renege on his offer? Didn't Columbus' own countrymen drop a bunch of false charges on him and send him home in chains? Visibly flustered now, Governor Schiari said, See, such terrible behavior does happen and has always happened, but we keep moving forward, no? Even today, we have a terrible misunderstanding between this sector and the new settlements, do we not? Trevor looked more serious, but sympathetic at the same time. I see what you're getting at, Fabrizio, and yes, we do have a problem, one in which I have a very personal stake in solving. I hope you do not feel that we are taking this out on you or your constituents personally, because that is not the case at all. But the bonds of brotherhood must not mean bondage of your innocent brothers, does it? Do you not share some of the responsibility when those to whom you are paying tribute are committing such unjust acts? And when those people commit such acts in your name, should you not share the retribution? Van Leeuwan was skewering some apple slices and putting them onto his plate, while the governor gazed briefly out the windows. After another swig of lemonade, Trevor continued, I know you had no idea what the JSO was up to, and you couldn't. But how often, when you hear of such doings, do you pause and reflect that you have had some small part in them? Are you just glad it didn't happen to you? Do you try to justify what they did in your mind to help you sleep at night? Van Leeuwan wasn't sure, but there might have even been a small tear in the governor's eye. That would be too much to hope for, and not last long enough to be useful. Finally, Trevor said, Look, Fabrizio, there is quite a lot you can do to help bring down the temperature. You're the one who moves in those circles. I'm not. I just don't speak their language. Though if the meanings of all the terms quit changing, I would certainly give it a try. As the Italian Americans say, maybe you know a guy who knows another guy, capiche? Rattle their cages a bit. See if someone will back down and do the right thing, eh? Those men and women in the settlements just want to be treated like grown-ups. So they have decided to do business with some people and not others. That might be very passive-aggressive, but it is certainly not a crime. All of the critical stuff will keep operating. We're not animals, smiled Van Leeuwan. Trevor stood up, shook the governor's hand, and said his polite goodbyes. Unlike the governor, he could not do this sort of thing all day. Fabrizio Scharen was rattled. He had met many CEOs and self-made men, but this guy pulled no punches whatsoever. He talked about respect and justice, and he actually meant it. He thought about his old friend from school. It had been over a year since he had talked to him. They were roughly at the same place in their careers now, and he felt this was the one person he should contact to get some pointers on the guy. Letting his viewer calculate the time back on Earth, he said, Record a transmission for Francois Lavoisier in French Polynesia, personal. The viewer's red light came on, and it said, Transmission to President Francois Lavoisier of French Polynesia, personal, ready to record. Scharen took around 10 minutes for the catching up part, what dinners he had attended, what honorary awards he had won, what celebrities he had met. He described his job for a bit on Mars, then caught up on his wife and family and what they were up to. Of course he wanted the same update from Francois. Then he told him of his first and only meeting with Trevor Van Leeuwan and the current situation on Mars, in his own words, not those of the news nets or gossip. He knew that Lavoisier was quite familiar with VLC and the Van Leeuwans. Just what was he supposed to do with this guy? The governor did not know how long the transmission would take past the current speed of light limit of 12 Mars minutes. His message would have to queue up with the currently overcrowded communication system due to the boycott. That was just one more thing his government failed to maintain properly. Chapter 20. Don't drone me, bro. Van Leeuwan had an important meeting with the VLC Space Operations Center regarding additional satellite intelligence. They were observing a lot more activity at or near the Mars Northern Military Reserve than when they first started monitoring them. Trevor, relieved to be out of his meeting and done with the governor for now, arrived in the late afternoon. The director of VLC's Space Operations Center, Mars, was an experienced spacefarer and engineer. James Ka'akai had worked and flown out of Thicken and Taha'a before transferring to Mars. He always felt the Earth's space traffic was messy, illogical, and way too full of space junk, and didn't want that to happen to Mars. He had a tenuous relationship with the nation's treaty ground control office and deep space network. Often they would take his suggestions a year or two after he had made them. Equally often, they would ignore him, and a number of accidents had been prevented only because his people could think on their feet. Thankfully, the prospectors and private explorers had their own communications networks. Akai, with his usual precision, started the meeting right on time. If you were late, you would have to catch what you missed from the video record when it was over. You could back it up and replay it after you disrupted everything, at the risk of dirty looks from the director. Ladies and gentlemen, a few days ago, you saw the new angle images and enhancements of the Mars Northern Military Reserve. Since the raid, we have noticed considerably more activity. It looks like someone kicked over an ant's nest and a bee's nest both. The video showed a great deal of movement in vehicles and people outside with pressure suits. Ships landed and ships took off. Already, the debris of the fuel truck had been cleared. The APC had been righted and driven off based upon the tracks shown. We are watching barriers go up around the fuel tanks and additional towers being built. It appears that they are increasing redundancy for their scanners and creating crossfire zones for the gunners, also new. Pointing to a far corner of the viewer, James said, "And we missed this before, but it looks like spots for several new landing pads are being prepared." Van Leeuwan asked, "What about ship traffic to the site, James?" Nodding to himself, Ka'akai flipped forward a couple of slides. This is a chart showing the number of takeoffs and landings since the raid. You can see the stair-step jump in volume and frequency. They don't have many spare pads there, so to move people or supplies, they have to do it quickly. It's also a very expensive way to truck things around, but they are so very far away from everything, they don't have much of a choice. We have seen a lot more vehicles moving cross-country, especially fuel and oxygen tankers. Another reconnaissance office analyst asked, "But where would the tankers or other vehicles be coming from?" Van Leeuwan said, "That seems to be the million-ingot question. There's nothing to the east but Olympus Mons, and that's a long way. And besides the tourist facilities and mass driver stations, it's pretty lonely out there. Freight can be moved by maglev up to the base of Olympus Mons and up the slopes, but nowhere near that base." James flipped to the appropriate slide, showing a mock-up of two of the newer surveillance satellites. "We put these two new birds up 73 days ago. We combed the bugs out of the manufacturer's software and added a few of our own enhancements, namely some spanking new spectrometers from the VLC labs. No one else in the solar system has anything as sensitive as these." James continued, "As it turns out, the reservation is not as lonely as we thought. We were dialing in these new satellites recently, and we kept getting some kind of EM radiation from the surface where it shouldn't be happening. Let me just call up those images to show you first." On the viewer was a short looping video shot in IR of some light fuzzy dots roaming over the surface and some outbuildings that looked very out of place. "Hold on, let me zoom out. We'll go back to the radiation in a moment, but I wanted everyone to see where it was first located. I'll leave the cursor over the IR sources." As he moved out, he kept talking. "You see? The anomaly was coming from an area just to the northwest of Olympus Mons. There are lava tubes all over the volcano naturally. Tourists stay in them when they visit in the south." Trevor always had a good eye for detail. "You probably saw a few large natural skylights where the tubes have caved in. Those would be ideal places to land a ship if you did not want anyone else to see. And the lava tubes, we know, can go on for days. There could very well be tubes and boreholes with underground roads connecting the reserve and ice station Zebra here. There are alluvial flows from that side of the volcano that could be processed for fuel and water. If they are doing it underground, the processors would be difficult to detect." The analyst, Nadine Gomez, interjected, "If there are processors underground, they need a decent power plant. Normally, even a large nuclear power plant would be difficult to detect if it was above ground, but below? Who would do that? These new satellites should be able to pick them up if we tell them what to look for regarding those anomalies. These birds are going to be parked in synchronous orbit, so we can look 24/7. We can also look for unusual heat signatures that any nuke plant might be putting out, depending on how far underground it is. Even then, there is excess heat. It has to dump somewhere. There's essentially no background IR radiation, so that should help tremendously. This is true, said Ka-Okai, in an effort to regain control of the meeting. The detectors on these new satellites are state-of-the-art. They're designed for tracking ships entering the atmosphere, for takeoffs and landings, avoiding potential accidents, and many other things I could list. In a short while, we will have more data than we know what to do with, if that is possible. Trevor treated this opening to segue back to the original topic. So, James, getting back to those faint radiation bursts, do you have any idea what they are? Ka-Okai looked puzzled. He always preferred to have at least some semblance of a theory. No, Mr. Van Leeuwan. So far it resembles ionized CO2, but it is anyone's guess as to what's causing it. The power being radiated is very low. It might be a byproduct of some independent process or the result of something they were doing down there. When we concentrate on the infrared scans, perhaps they will show up again. Van Leeuwan couldn't say it in this room, but there was something very familiar about the movement of those radiation sources. Mr. Ka-Okai, with what little satellite data you have on those fuzzy dots there, have you plotted their direction, speed, and altitude? James looked a little frustrated, but being as thorough as he was, he did have slides for this contingency. Now this video is enhanced nearly to max magnification. You see the dots moving in various patterns like circles, figure eights, or running with several as a group in what looks like a flight formation. The background is just your basic Martian desert. There's nothing jumping out there for reference. Next, we have the computer overlay a labeled grid showing the distances in kilometers, meters, or whatever, depending on the scale we choose. The analyst, Nadine, was working ahead of the group, as she tended to do. She had her viewer plot some of the dots moving in formation, leaving their tracks in red on her screen, where they had changed direction abruptly. She clipped and selected those sections. Finally, she had the computer calculate their radius of curvature and estimate the acceleration. She looked a little shocked, but asked, "Excuse me, but could you all take a look at this?" She hit a command to display her markup and calculations on the main viewer. Those blobs look like they are under flight control at about 200 meters above the ground. It's difficult to say, but none of them look like they span more than 3 meters in any direction. Look at the acceleration, though. Even if they were drones, they should not be able to do that without flying apart. Those G-forces are just too high. Though he already knew the answer, Van Leeuwan asked, "So, is it possible that these are some kind of experimental craft? That could explain the secrecy and the sudden appearance of a facility that has no business being there. The size, also, would suggest that if they are some new craft, then these are only prototype models." Ka-Okai said, "That could be it. We'll refine our surveillance in that area and put a few people on the analysis full-time. The Northern Military Reservation got grandfathered in by what shenanigans, I don't know. But if we are talking about additional facilities way out there, then that's a horse of a different color." Trevor hoped against hope that his intuition would be wrong. The only way to find out what these jokers were doing way out there was to take a couple of teams in on the ground. That would be easier said than done. There was very little growing on Mars, at least nothing over 80 centimeters high yet. Anyone could see you coming from 10 kilometers away, out there in the open plains. "All right then," Trevor said, standing up. "Thank you all for getting me up to speed on the doings in the West. It is disturbing, but you're doing good work. It's always better to have some advance warning of these things. Stay on it and keep me informed. However, there may be another way you can help me out there." Ka-Okai said, "Sure, if we can. What is it, Chief?" Trevor continued, "James, I believe you guys are working on some state-of-the-art micro-drones?" Ka-Okai, like a proud papa, said, "Oh, you've heard of those, eh?" "Yes, since VLC encourages us to do our own research. Some of my people have been working on drones for operation in space or on the surface and all kinds. And all kinds, not just micro-drones. Nadine here is on that team, so she could fill you in on almost anything you need to know." Van Leeuwan said, "All right, Ms. Gomez, I'm in your hands. Show me everything that you folks are working on, if it is ready to be shown. I'm an engineer, so I don't like to put out things that are not ready. It's up to you." Ka-Okai looked at Nadine and said, "Go ahead, take him down to the lab. He hasn't been there in a while." The first workbench she took Van Leeuwan to see was piled high with equipment but he didn't see any drones there. Gomez handed Trevor a face mask and had him put on some latex gloves. She then took a tray used for electronic components out of a dry nitrogen box and placed it under a microscope. She looked into the scope and focused on one of the shallow slots in the tray. A camera attached to the microscope displayed an odd-shaped black dot on the tray. Nadine switched on several pieces of equipment on the bench along with the computer. Moving over to the computer, she said, "Keep an eye on that black dot. That's the drone. It will look like a small bug." Typing in some commands, the drone stood up and walked to the edge of the slot it was in and climbed out. Following instructions, it started walking around the outside of the pit. Then Nadine backed off the magnification, showing at least 30 slots in the tray, with 30 drones all performing the same actions, walking around their respective slots. Each of the drones began flexing a set of clear wings that Trevor had not noticed before. They don't fly so well in full atmosphere if there is a lot of wind or thermal variations, but this lab is pretty stable. They're actually made for the Martian atmosphere. She typed in a few more commands, then by voice said, "Tell me who is sitting on the other side of the lab." With that, the swarm took off and flew across the lab, hovering in front of a woman's face for a few seconds, then racing back to their tray. On the computer screen, a mosaic of different portions of a picture, like hundreds of overlapping pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, assembled itself into the image of a woman's face. Then a line said, "Matching, matching, matching." Finally, a voice came from the computer. "The person sitting across the laboratory is Julia Schaefer." "I have to say that I'm impressed," said Trevor. Nadine said, "I'm glad you are happy with them. They are more like spyware than other things I've worked on, but you never know when they will come in handy. How about I just give you a rundown on some things we have cooking, and that might help you know if that is what you are looking for at the moment." Trevor said, "That's very practical. I knew there was a reason we hired you," smiling. "To tell you the truth, I am looking for some spy or rather reconnaissance type hardware. I need some drones that can hover for a long time to reconnoiter the Martian terrain and determine if there are underground dwellings or structures, as well as the ways in and out. Then I need something that can look for a way in and out, like hitchhiking onto someone in a pressure suit to get inside. Once inside, the drone has to be able to collect data on the layout of the interior, general movements of people, life support functions such as water, power, CO2 scrubbers, etc." Nadine said, "I think we could set you up, Mr. Van Leeuwan. We have drones that do all of those things and could stay well hidden. We have some that disguise themselves with various metallic finishes and colors so they just become part of the background, like those moths in England in the Industrial Revolution. Ours look more like stainless steel than soot, though." Van Leeuwan said, "What if I'm not able to retrieve them?" Nadine thought, "Well, the drones are mostly recyclable. I mean that seriously. They could just be given the command to head for the nearest compactor and quietly self-destruct. What's left could not be reverse engineered. We also have some that are biodegradable." Trevor had to ask, "Biodegradable, Nicole?" Ms. Gomez continued, "Yes, we have some of the insect types that are 95% biodegradable. They could burrow into the ground or a pile of leaves or a potted plant. In 3 weeks, there will be little trace of it. Less if there are scavengers about. And our drones can generally draw power from stray EM in the air or sitting next to a circuit running at reasonable amperage. The bugs I first showed you are solar, of course, but if there are any vehicles or power devices on the surface, they can charge by induction. These drones can last for years if they aren't weathered or abused in any way." Van Leeuwan said, "Are all of those types you talked about available now?" Nadine said, "Yes, except for the ones I first showed you." "There's one more question," Trevor said. "If these drones go in underground to a lava tube habitat, say, and this area is supposed to be very secure, would any of your drones be able to hack the communications to get a line out back to me? I mean, if they have all this information and cannot broadcast it, I have to be able to get it somehow." Nadine thought for a minute. "Sounds like time is a big concern for you. I'll get with the software people to load some of these drones with the best hacking code we have. We'll get working on it right away. Since we are mapping everything, we can transfer that information from one drone to the other for redundancy. They will all have their eyes on the exits for the exfiltration. Physically moving them out of the airlocks is the best way to ensure we retrieve all the data and to account for all the drones. Trevor was very impressed with this analyst. She had the whole thing wired. Thank you, Nadine. You've been very helpful. I'll let you and your bosses know just what we need and when after I check with some other people. Chapter 21. She was lost in space. The next morning, Trevor received a call from one of the investigators out at drill site number 1. Roberto put it through on a secure line. There was some preliminary information they wished to share with him regarding the 3 spacecraft being held there at the site and their forensic investigations. It seemed that the pirate crews were caught with their pants down, as it were. There was a lot of personal information available on these guys, including logs, communications, diaries, and other records they did not have time to destroy. Along with DNA they had collected, this could yield positive IDs on most, if not all of them. He told them he would try to make it out to the site tomorrow. He would speak with them some more then, but the update was greatly appreciated. When he finished with the investigator, he remembered something he was going to ask Ka-Okai yesterday and put a call through to him. "Hello, James," said Trevor. "There was something else I needed you guys to look into, but forgot to mention it yesterday. Space Operations runs a pretty tight ship, so maybe you have the answer already. I'm looking into 3 plasma boosters with habitats for 3 medium-sized freighters orbiting Mars and or the Moon right now, or parked at a Lagrange point. Do you know of any that have entered orbit under suspicious circumstances in the last couple of weeks? Say some that don't have working transponders or problems with paperwork to bring them here on the QT. They might be running under some super secret JSO authority. In fact, I would almost bet on it." Next, he put in a call to Ferniko Haruda. "Hello, Ferniko. Have you ever had dinner in an oil field?" Around mid-morning the next day, Trevor received a call from Ka-Okai regarding the 3 plasma boosters. He did have some information. There were periodic snafus with paperwork and misidentification given the volume of traffic in the Earth-Moon system. Space Operations themselves might drop the ball themselves on occasion. Running across 3 spacecraft at the same time with mysterious origins was unusual. James did not know how Van Leeuwan knew the exact number and timing. It was astonishing, but not out of the ordinary. Trevor was full of surprises and strange requests. Ka-Okai was used to it at this stage. He was that way back in Ta'a, so he knew better than to ask questions. "Yep, you nailed it, sir. It looks like 3 kings following the same star," James said. "As you suspected, 2 of them orbiting the Moon are under some nebulous JSO authority. They're supposed to keep us apprised, even using their temporary registration numbers. The 3rd, parked at L2, seems to be under some Franco-German flag under the name Lafayette, but the Central Ships Registry does not have it listed. All 3 of them have habitats to accommodate medium freighter crew, plus the same number of passengers." Trevor then asked, "I take it your routine is to do your best to identify any unknown vessels?" Ka-Okai replied, "You got it, boss. We don't want any of these things falling out of the sky or drifting into the shipping lanes. And if they do, we want to know who they belong to." Finally, Trevor asked, "Do you have any detailed images of these craft? I am trying to play matchmaker." James said, "Got it, sir. We do have a fair set of images, including some high-quality holograms. We had the fleet do a little skulking around after we got your request for information. You should be receiving these in the next 15 minutes. Ferniko Haruda took up Van Leeuwan on his dinner invitation and tour of drill site number 1. Haruda Metals was selling VLC a lot of steel and other alloys for the refinery, processing facilities, and pipelines. Besides, she still got excited when whole new vistas and industries took a foothold on Mars. She still loved being a part of it all and working with others who felt the same. Trevor arrived via the company limousine, pulling up to Haruda Metals HQ at 2 p.m. sharp, local Mars time. Waving the driver back to his front seat, he opened the door for Miss Haruta, who looked genuinely excited for this excursion. Though it was only a 15-minute ride to the west airlocks, he felt the limousine was a meaningful gesture for someone of Miss Haruta's accomplishments. At the west airlocks, the limousine waited for the door to open and pulled into the bay marked VLC carriages 1, 2, and 3. Van Leeuwan opened the door for Ferniko and escorted her to the ramp for number 3. This was Van Leeuwan's personal pressurized carriage, but it was used for company purposes. It was rather nondescript on the outside, with understated Art Deco styling in sky blue and silver. There were rows of windows along each side, making it look a bit like an old locomotive club car. Both themes were far more pronounced on the inside of the carriage. There were beautiful hardwood panels, Art Deco sconces, moldings, and mirrors. Even the furniture was very stylized. The entire carriage was about twice the width of a 21st century city bus and about twice as long. A segregated but contiguous portion at the rear accommodated a security team of 3 plus 1 steward/cook. Near the front of the carriage and across the rear, in an antique wavy script, was the name Percival Lowell. A separate tractor unit connected the carriage to provide locomotion. Since it would take over 2 hours to get out to the site, he figured that they may as well go in style. They moved along the recently cut road, some of it already paved here and there. Out, away from the road, there were a different series of stakes. Some had red ribbons, some blue, yellow, orange, or other. These marked out the future pipelines. Along the edges of the valley, near the walls, one could see the various algae blooms and some lichen fields closer to the road. The workers would get them on their boots, and like Johnny Appleseed, would spread them around wherever they worked. If conditions are right, then new colonies would form. Taking full advantage of their time together, Trevor and Ferniko discussed the VLC timelines and lead times for Haruta prefabrication. Also covered was the delivery of key components and on-site assembly. One of the reasons why Trevor picked Haruta was that they were excellent fabricators and had never missed a delivery date, at least not on any of the VLC projects. In addition, they had geniuses in their laboratories who could cook up a specialty alloy for almost any purpose. Upon arrival at drill site number 1, Trevor gave instructions to the driver so they could tour the far-flung facilities. They slowly drove past some of the drilling rigs as Trevor explained how they and their crews worked in this low-pressure environment. The carriage had an abbreviated second story, which was made primarily of transparent materials, and a stairway from the lower living area. Van Leeuwan explained to Ferniko that when he was spending a lot of time living and working out here, he had this observation bubble retrofitted to the carriage. He liked to put a little cot or chair up here and go to sleep under the stars or just chill out after a long day. They rode up here as they toured the VLC claim. They stopped for a while at the refinery and processing stations and went over the construction diagram and project timeline. A couple of the Haruta foremen were escorted in through the airlocks of the carriage so Ferniko could get some of the real poop from the guys doing the work. Work was on time or slightly ahead of schedule for each of the plants they were subcontracting. Then we piped nearly all of our products out of here and back to where they are needed, Trevor said, as they toured the head distribution point for the pipelines. Trevor, I am very impressed, and you've accomplished all of this in 18 months? I mean, since you capped your wellheads? Trevor was impressed too, but he said, well, we could not have done it without the reliable professional contractors who understand what we are trying to do. It's been quite a day so far. I don't know about you, but I'm famished. The smells from the kitchen are really getting me going. The cook may be about to surpass himself again. Van Leeuwan told the driver to take them over to one of the tented hangars, indicated by the flashing purple beacons. The doors would open for him when they got there, and he should pull inside. Once inside, the carriage was parked alongside of the tent, with a canvas barrier raised to the ceiling to block the rest of the contents. They dined on the finest available steak and lobster on Earth or Mars, with all the trimmings. The meal was served by the steward/cook in the dining room. Trevor had insisted they adjourn there before the carriage reached the tent. Ferniko thought this odd, but dismissed it as one of his many idiosyncrasies. There was more friendly conversation as they enjoyed their dessert, coffee, and tea. Trevor was enjoying himself and said, Fernico, I had an ulterior motive for inviting you out here this evening. Fernico briefly looked shocked but said, Why, Mr. Van Leeuwan, don't you always have one of those? And by the way, I'm old enough to be your mother. She laughed. Trevor really was embarrassed now over his choice of words and timing. Soldiering on, he cleared his throat. Yeah. Well, now I really don't know how to phrase this. Not making it any easier for him, Fernico was laughing out loud now. It's okay, Trevor. Just be out with it. Truly squirming now, Trevor said, Okay, there's something I want to show you. We need to go upstairs to the observation deck. Still giggling, Fernico got up and walked to the stairwell, followed by Trevor. They slowly made their way up to the darkened bubble, with only the lighted stairs to guide them. There were just a few faint lights in the floor for them to find their way. Okay, now, stand there in the center of the bubble, and face that way, as he indicated the curtain side. All of the lights in the hangar were off. Are you looking for Nico? Asked Trevor. Yes. What am I looking at? Trevor clicked a remote in his hand. Simultaneously, floor and ceiling lights shined outward, away from the carriage, and the curtain fell to the ground. Fernico Haruta stood there in shock, then moved to the interior of the bubble, putting her palms against the glass. I don't believe it. I just can't believe it. She started laughing, then crying, then doing both at the same time. It's the Nakamura Maru. It's the Nakamura Maru. It's my father's ship. Trevor stepped back, letting her take in the moment. In genuine amazement, Fernico turned to Trevor and said, How? When? I practically grew up on this ship. I know every inch of her, or used to. I thought those bastards had taken her forever, or destroyed her out of spite. I've been trying to put her out of my mind. Van Leeuwan brought some chairs over because she looked a little wobbly from the shock, or the wine. He said, Well, she's back, and she is yours. But, if you don't mind, I would like my investigators to go over her again one more time. I'm certain that you still want to nail the people who grabbed her, or used her for nefarious purposes. Wiping the tears from her eyes, Miss Haruta said, Yes, of course, Trevor, patting him on the leg. I already feel so much better that she is here being watched over by you. Trevor said, We had a pretty good idea that it was a Nakamura Maru. I would not have brought you out here to be disappointed. He brought the curtain halfway up again and projected some images on its surface. The screen showed a bank of 3 engines in a triangular arrangement with a large spherical reactor section forward of them and an even larger spherical propellant section forward of that. A large toroid about 30 meters thick rotated about the central axis of the ship. Slowly he flipped through various images in different views of the plasma engine with its attached habitat and better views of the clamps intended for the Nakamura. It's the Kananobu Maru, the plasma driver mate for the Nakamura Maru, said Fernico. Where is she? She said in a low tone, more angry now than happy after her boost of morale and confidence. That's what we figured after our engineers matched the mating clamp and the hatch locations on the Nakamura, said Trevor. Right now she is parked at L2 under the name Lafayette, though the name and your ship do not match in the directory. I have so many questions I wish to ask you. So many questions I know you cannot answer now, or maybe ever. Fernico smiled and said, You have been a very naughty boy, Van Leeuwan-san. Trevor smiled back, saying, Naughty or nice, you know, it's always in the eye of the beholder. With the forces we are dealing with, the rabbit hole only seems to get deeper and deeper. You know you have every right to file papers for the return of the Kananobu Maru, especially if she's in someone's possession illegally. Fernico sighed. Yes, I have all kinds of rights, but as soon as I exercise them, that ship will be gone in a flash, broken up and sold for scrap, and you know it. She is, as you say, one hand clapping right now? Trevor thought for a second. Well, whoever has her right now, and we are working hard to find out, might not want to be so quick to chop her up, at least until they know what happened to the Nakamura. They are a matched pair, after all, and there hasn't been enough time to mount a serious investigation. Fernico sighed again. Some wildcat miners would love to tow her out to the belt for a cozy setup. Nuclear power for a decade, plus artificial gravity. That's way better than living in near zero, eating food out of one bag and peeing into another one. Very serious note, Trevor said. Fernico, we may have to snatch this ship out from under them. If that is the case, we need a plan. You and your crews know this vessel better than anyone. You folks know if there are vulnerabilities or just annoying bugs, hardware or software, we can take advantage of. Any secret passages, private holds, or auxiliary controls, it could all help. Fernico said, Right now I'm all in, though I need to talk to my people to see how much they want to participate. I know you did not bring my ship back all by yourself. Some of your crews and security teams took part. Now is there something else you wish to get off your chest, Van Leeuwan-san? Trevor had no choice really but to enlighten Fernico on the connection between her ships and the JSO. He told her he had actionable intelligence through a sympathetic military source, but was not going to name him. This source told us where to find the pirate ships. It was way out west of Olympus Mons at the Mars Northern Military Reserve, so we figured we had a right to take those ships and their crews back for evidence and trial. They were living it up out there so far as possible with the JSO. They certainly were not in custody, as they insinuated. This is the same JSO who stood by while an act of piracy was in progress. He went on to tell her about VLC's research into the 3 plasma drive vessels, including the Kananobu Maru, back at Earth, Moon, under mysterious circumstances. Fernico was glued to her chair, trying to process every word Trevor was saying. So here's the thing, Van Leeuwan said, thinking out loud as he paced around the bubble. We've got to go public soon because we can't continue to hold these guys without them getting some sort of representation for court. That would go against the very values we are defending. But when we go public with the pirates, we have to go public with the ships, or no one will believe these guys are who we say they are, Van Leeuwan went on. Those 2 plasma drive rigs are tied up under some kind of JSO cover story in lunar orbit. We're working on what their designation really is, which I doubt is legitimate. Maybe I can ask the little birds who told me about the pirates' lair. Already a hornet's nest has been stirred up at the reservation, from our satellite data anyway. They don't know who have the ships yet, so I suspect they are only locking the barn doors after the horses have escaped. I am working under the assumption that if we have 1, alleged pirates in custody, 2, at least 1 ship identified by the owner, and potentially 3, custody of the Kananobu Maru in Mars orbit, then we should have a good amount of public opinion on our side. Fernico added, I understand what you're getting at. There's almost no time to retrieve the Kananobu Maru before you go public. Could I get you to hold any decisions on that before I meet with some of my key people? If possible, I would not want her to get away a second time without trying. Moving toward the stairs, Trevor used the remote and lowered the curtain to the floor once more, then said, It's getting late, and we should be getting back to the settlements. I'll give you a few minutes up here alone before we move out. I'll go see what the cook and security are doing and notify the driver. Fernico once again looked serious. Trevor, I cannot tell you how much this has meant to me, and I will never forget it. She gave him a big hug and said, smiling and pushing Van Leeuwan in the direction of the stairs, Okay, get out of here before I lose my reputation for being a cold-hearted bitch. When Fernico Haruta came back downstairs, everything had been squared away from dinner. It looked like her mascara had run slightly, but Trevor would not bring it up. She would catch it herself, and nothing more would be said. The Percival Lowell, in train with her hauler, rejoined the main road as the lights went out in the hangar. Re-engaging with Fernico, Trevor said, The road crews like to call it Highway 1. The subcontractors and the drill site workers quickly adopted it. She glanced past him, out the window, noticing the solar-powered beacons delineating the road flying by silently as they passed. You know, there might be a way to temporarily disable those 2 plasma drivers in lunar orbit, she said. Her family's company was called Haruda Metals, but Ferniko, like her father, was always far more in love with the spacecraft and shipbuilding side of the business than with mining. Are you talking about the A35 codes? Exactly, said Ferniko. Those ships might still have the original Scram codes in them. It's a long shot, but if we could find out who owns them, we could make sure they were parked for a long time. We have the codes for the Kanenobu Maru, and if we could get close enough, we could ping the ship to see if both the activation codes and the lockout codes are still valid. Chapter 22. The Archimedes. There was some history between the Harudas and the Van Leeuwans in the shipping industry. Trevor's great-uncle, Lysander Van Leeuwan, pushed for a more sane way to get around the solar system. Even though the Van Leeuwans were technologically far ahead of anyone in the Earth's solar system, it was deemed that introducing all of their advances to the society would be extremely dangerous. At the same time, taking 7 to 10 months to Mars one way seemed incredibly ridiculous. There were easier ways to go. Chihiro Haruda was Ferniko's paternal grandmother, a noted physicist, nuclear engineer, and designer. She read an op-ed piece written by Lysander and got in touch with him to show him some designs she had been working on. She also agreed that the political restrictions were grossly affecting the exploration of the solar system and future economic developments. Checking their schedules, they found that they would both be in the UK in the same week. They met at a hotel on the Isle of Man, which they thought was sufficiently out of the way for what they were discussing. Dr. Haruda laid out her plans for building fission reactors in a modular way. The components would be ferried into orbit to be assembled in space. The shipping capacity existed to do this. It would be expensive, but the savings in time over the long run would more than pay for it. Capabilities, thought far too impractical now, would become a reality. Habitats could also be built in a modular way and reconstructed in orbit. The time spent exposed to deadly cosmic rays would be vastly reduced. Long stretches in low gravity, despite advances in exoskeleton designs, were still detrimental to health. Worse yet, the confinement in small spaces took a great psychological toll on most people. Lysander was sold. He had been for a long time. The question was how to persuade the masses that one could build and operate nuclear reactors in space in a safe way for humans. No one was going to sponsor a project like that, so VLC did. Or one of her newly minted subsidiaries would. Haruda Metals and VLC became the sole investors in their new company, Prometheus Plasma Propulsion. It was all done very quietly. Even those who thought they knew what they were working on did not have the complete picture. It was thought of as more of a pet project than a real company, something to keep the rich kids busy. A lot of groundwork had been done in the area of plasma engines. Prometheus angered more than one other startup or established company by enticing some of their best people to work for them. Recruiters plucked up some outstanding talent overlooked by those establishment universities favoring diversity of color over diversity of skills and effort. Components were built in VLC and Haruda shipyards on Earth and assembled in their space docks after extensive testing. Prometheus had gone all out with the engines, nuclear plants, habitat, and docking mechanism for a standard starship. After 4.5 years, the Archimedes was completed and towed to a high Earth orbit. It was never discovered where the fissionable material came from. Lysander never said, though he was barraged with accusations and threats later on. There was more than one sovereign nation on the planet doing that sort of development, and most of them were in financial trouble. Because they would not be forced to sign any agreements that would actually endanger or enslave their people, they were punished. To Lysander, demonstrating another peaceful use of nuclear energy was worth the risk, and Dr. Haruda agreed. Public opinion was key to the success of the Archimedes space trials, and was one thing at which Lysander excelled. He knew that if the trials were devastating to the current, overregulated and stultified environment, then the punishment would be minimal. All the kids would want one. Some notable alternative media personalities were invited to the launching of the Archimedes on her first trip to Mars. She launched from L2, or as some like to say, the dark side of the moon. That same day, the pride of the Royal Navy, the HMS Queen Elizabeth III, was launching from Earth to the Red Planet. Her ETA at Mars was 8.5 months. Of course, Lysander, Dr. Haruta, and Prometheus knew when the QE3 was launching and timed their impromptu-looking press release accordingly. The Archimedes slowly slipped out of her parking orbit and into the elongated orbit about the Earth. She stayed in this orbit for 3 days while the HMS Queen Elizabeth III rocketed off into the blackness. There was a lot of guffawing and finger-pointing by the media because they were either too ignorant of the laws of physics or were gaslighting the public into thinking their experts knew best. No one was telling the children the story of the tortoise and the hare anymore. For weeks, there was very little on the news nets about the Archimedes or the QE3. If there was anything in the primary media about either, the only item to come up was the ramifications of Prometheus and Lysander Van Leeuwan's possible dealings with terrorist regimes to obtain nuclear materials. There was a lot of saber-rattling by the usual politicians and some op-ed pieces, but for such an issue, the coverage was remarkably subdued. It was felt that the self-appointed elite privately wanted to know how this gamble would pay off. Though Prometheus was using the Deep Space Network and paying handsomely to do it, they always seemed to have communication problems. And when Prometheus did get through to the Archimedes and reported her position, the Deep Space Network would never confirm it. 8 weeks and 3 days after launch, the Archimedes went into orbit around the fourth rock from the Sun. The 337 people on Mars were ecstatic because they knew exactly what this meant. The Deep Space Network went dark concerning the Archimedes, which turned into a huge scandal later on. Dr. Haruta contacted some of her colleagues in the astronomical underground, and a few dishes were turned to Mars. The crew of the Archimedes announced their arrival once more amid spewing champagne and loud music. The broadcast was replayed all over Earth for days. 5 days later, there was a distress call from the HMS Queen Elizabeth III. She had discovered several tiny leaks in a liquid oxygen tank, most likely from micrometeorites. Not all of the holes were accessible for repair or even identified at this point. There was a question of whether she would be able to make Mars with full life support, or would she have enough oxidizers to decelerate into orbit. The point was she had to have enough oxygen to do both, or they were all dead. From the moment they knew of the distress call, Prometheus looked up her position and her planned trajectory. The people in mission planning were tasked to see if she could possibly be intercepted on the way to Mars. It would not be easy. The Archimedes would have to accelerate to go back to the QE3, decelerate to change direction, then accelerate again to match the HMS QE3 on her trajectory toward Mars. There would need to be time enough to repair the ship if possible. It was questionable whether or not there was enough room in the Archimedes to take the entire crew if all was lost. Prometheus left it up to the captain and crew of the Archimedes. They were risking the most, but Prometheus would support them to the hilt. Lysander and Chihiro made an announcement that a repair and rescue mission was possible and would be attempted by the Archimedes. Crew members of the HMS Queen Elizabeth III were happy to hear this news, but kept up with their repair attempts all the same. They were having some better luck identifying the leaks, though they were not all easily accessible. Crawling over the surface or cutting holes in the outer skin of the ship to insert oxygen sniffers or patch holes was grueling work. They were still less than halfway to Mars. This was Apollo 13 on steroids. The news nets, nasty as some of them were, stopped the hype long enough to explain the news. Every day, the courses of the two ships were plotted and replotted in schools, homes, businesses, bars, and restaurants. People were following it like they followed the various fronts in World War II. Prometheus explained the complex path Archimedes would have to follow to meet up with the HMS QE3. The Royal Engineers had charts and diagrams showing how the HMS QE3 crewmen were attempting repairs. From the meager Mars stores, Prometheus was allowed to top off her liquid oxygen tanks so she could transfer what was needed to the QE3 before she set off into the void. With trajectories calculated and recalculated, the Prometheus set off on her rescue mission. Captain Isadora Vasquez kept up with the progress of the QE3 repairs so she would know what to expect. She drilled her engineers and made sure they were up to speed with the latest developments. They even passed along a few suggestions despite the communication delays. Sweating it out on board the HMS Queen Elizabeth III, Commander Angus MacLeod was doing his best to manage expectations. The repairs were not going as fast or as well as he had hoped. New leaks were being found even now. He was starting to worry about the structural integrity of the tanks. The crew seemed to be holding up, though you could never tell. They were communicating with the crew of the Archimedes and to their loved ones back home. He was never so glad as when the Archimedes was finally in the rear and moving up to join them on this last maneuver. She was slowly rotating so the two ships would be nose to nose. There would not be any hard docking here. A flexible tube was stretched between the two ships, and crew members would pull themselves through from one ship to the other. The computer of the Archimedes took over attitude control for both ships to maintain coordination. There was a fine window even to make repairs, so both crews hit the ground running. Having compared notes and making calculations as they approached each other, they were very much on the same track. Engineers from the Archimedes spelled those from the HMS QE3 who were burned out with such tedious and delicate work. They had some much improved tools and leak detectors, which made the work go faster. In shifts, the British crew spent time in the habitat sucking up the artificial gravity and loving it. In the end, both crews had done everything that could have been done without a dry dock. The best calculations said they would run short of oxygen 25 days too early. Topping off with more liquid oxygen would only buy them another 10 days with a safe margin. Commander MacLeod had a crew of 22. Commander Vasquez said she would have to transfer 6 of them to the Prometheus so the HMS QE3 could conserve oxygen. The commander agreed and chose which crewman to move to the other ship. Commander MacLeod relayed his report back to Space Command UK. With the delay and bureaucracy, it usually took some time to get a reply, but it came very quickly this time. The High Command wanted Commander MacLeod to request, on their behalf, that the 6 crewmen be transferred to the Archimedes for their return trip to Earth. She was only on her shakedown cruise, with no plan to stay at Mars. This had been cleared with Prometheus and the British government, who was very much interested in this new technology. The message was relayed to Captain Vasquez, who looked curious but said she needed to confirm it with her superiors. Vasquez relayed her report with this request back to Lysander Van Leeuwan and Dr. Haruta at Prometheus. They emphasized that, yes, they had approved taking on the Royal Navy crewmen, but they would not have a complete run of the ship. Proprietary portions could be explained in general terms, but no schematics or details should be revealed. The agreement was transferred with the message showing all of the relevant signatures. Captain Vasquez relayed her conversation to Commander MacLeod and gave him a copy of the agreement. The commander had no problem with it, not realizing how his superiors had subtly tried to get him to dupe her into believing she could be more open. Sad how good people were so manipulated and didn't even know it. The rest of the shakedown cruise was a fantastic success. A course was plotted to give the crew the closest human views to Venus and Mercury anyone had ever seen. The Royal Navy crew would talk about it for years. The HMS Queen Elizabeth III made it to Mars safely, with oxygen to spare. In the end, all was forgotten about the surreptitious acquisition of fissionable materials. Of course, there was still bad blood in elite circles about these companies, not sharing all of their sweat, blood, and intellectual property with their betters. In the end, so many people understood the concepts demonstrated by the Prometheus that once the regulations and silly rules had been lifted, a plethora of new industries were launched. Chapter 23. The Borders. Working from the Percival Lowell as they returned to the new settlements, Trevor and Fernico contacted their people to see if either had any craft at L2 or were on their way there. Fernico had called up the engineering diagrams of the Kananobu Maru and started paging through them, mostly from memory. If they were going to take the ship, they would need to board her. To board her, they did not want to make a lot of noise doing it or get anyone hurt. She didn't want to have to do an A35 on the reactors, and she didn't want the Kananobu's illegitimate crew doing it either. If that happened, she might never get her back. To get inside, there needed to be a path not necessarily known to this crew, whoever they were. With a luck that only occurs in science fiction novels, the old crew of the Kananobu Maru was taking leave on the moon in Armstrong City. Mayor Frigoris, Haruta Metals, acceded to their request to stay together as a crew after pirates absconded with their ship. Through attrition and reassignment of the previous crew, most of them were reunited on the Uda Maru and their companion plasma driver ship, the Yagi Maru. Armstrong City was one of the older cities on the moon, starting and growing because of the nearby ice deposits. The crew had been there for a week and had 3 weeks to go before getting a new assignment. Dembe Otuome was still captain of the combined crew and still stinging about the pirates. He was sitting in the bar with his compatriots when he received the message from Ms. Haruta. It wasn't every day he had a communication directly from the president and CEO of the company. The message was marked confidential and proprietary, so he excused himself from the bar and went to see if there was an empty conference room in the Aldrin Arms Hotel. The concierge had known him for years and keyed him in, no charge. Later, he had to admit he was taken aback by this older, very proper Japanese lady asking, "Captain Otioambe, how would you like to become a pirate?" Fernico and Trevor appeared together in the communication as they sent it from the Percival Lowell. She told him that the Nakamura Maru was back in their custody thanks to Trevor Van Leeuwan and VLC, showing him images of the vessel parked in the hangar. Dembe was gobsmacked as he listened and watched the transmission. "I know you are probably quite shocked right now," his boss continued. "I only found out about this evening, but we have some stringent time constraints here. As Mr. Van Leeuwan says, we cannot be like the people who have wronged us. We will have to make our case before the public and some neutral arbiter." Van Leeuwan continued, "As I told my own people, I cannot force you to take part in any of these activities, but we've chosen you because you are the best people for the job and stand for the same ideas that we stand for. VLC has security teams. They're in Armstrong City, trained in this sort of thing, but you and your people know the ship. The crew there may be completely innocent, with no knowledge of how their employers came by it, and we don't want anyone hurt. That's why I felt it best if you work directly with the security team. If there is any way to retake the ship, we'll need your crew to pilot her out of L2 to someplace more secure. For the most part, the plan will have to be yours. Check with either of us if there is anything else you need. The contact information for our security team is attached to this message." With his head still reeling, but regaining focus, Captain Otuome regained his composure. Of course he was in. Of course his crew would be in. That was not going to take any selling on his part. He and his crew would have to work quickly with the security team and his boss, who also knew the ship. In short order, they had to determine how to get on, in, take control, and fly out without anyone noticing. They would have to offload the current crew somewhere after determining if they had any knowledge material to the case, and it would all have to be done in the next 48 hours. Otuiome sent a brief message acknowledging that he understood the mission. He would confirm after contacting his crew and the security team. He then returned to the back corner of the bar, staked out by his people, waving to the barmaid and motioning to an invisible check in his hand. Captain Otuiome said, "Ladies and gentlemen, have I got a job for you?" VLC's security team came over from their lodgings to join up with the captain and crew in his suite. They took stock of what tools and resources they could put together in such a short time. It was both good and bad that they were working out of a large lunar city. It was good in a way of getting more specialized materials, but bad in there were a lot of snoops around to ask questions. They plotted late into the night. Neither wanted any screw-ups on this job. Ms. Haruda informed them that the lockout codes for the A35 should still be valid. There had to be no registration of new codes, but then again, the ship's registry as the Lafayette was still in question. The Lafayette had no plans to leave L2 for at least the next 6 days. VLC had a tender service operating out of Armstrong City that could prove useful. The tenders supplied fuel, food, tools, and other supplies as a kind of roving ship store. They also acted as a taxi service between the larger ships in parking orbits. Their ships could get right up next to anyone without immediate suspicion. As they broke up, the two teams set the time for their mission at 3 p.m. MCT tomorrow. Both would meet at the launch pads of VLC Tranquility tenders at that time with all of their equipment. This would give them time to load their gear and do a final walkthrough. Trevor had briefed those with a need to know at Tranquility tenders, so they had a heads up. Their jobs could be a bit boring at times, so they were up for some excitement. VLC-TT-0126 was ready for loading on this dedicated trip when they got there. No one gave them a second look as Captain Otuiome came in with their luggage, equipment, bags, and carry-ons. The same went for Sergeant Fisher and her security team. All of them looked like any other teamsters going to or coming from their vessels in orbit. Certain items were packed into the unpressurized section of the tender to make access easier later on. All were on board and everything was squared away before the scheduled 4 p.m. launch. The VLC-TT-0126 was configured for a railgun launch, as were most of the tenders. Since most tenders were relaying fuel supplies to their customers in orbit, it made no sense to use chemical rockets for that purpose from the moon. The ship was on her way in a roundabout path to the Earth-Moon L2 site. As the tender neared her destination, the security team changed into their pressure suits and gathered their equipment together. They moved into the airlock and the non-pressurized portion of the cargo section. On the bridge, the captain contacted the Lafayette, asking if there was any need of fuel or supplies. The answer was a negative from the target. Supplies were full up and a fuel delivery was already scheduled from another vendor. The VLC-TT-0126 had matched velocities with the Lafayette parked in a blind spot as indicated by Captain Otuiome. There was only one man on watch on Lafayette in the forward control room. Almost the entire crew was relaxing in the break room, and he was by himself here on the bridge. The VLC security team had exited the tender and sent grappling hooks over to the Lafayette, tying the line off on the exterior of VLC-TT-0126. They slid their equipment along the wires over to the target ship, disappearing into an external catwalk near the rear. With safety lines attached on the Lafayette, the security team disengaged the wires from their side. Two of them flashed their lights in the direction of the tender to signal their disconnection. The crewman manning communications on the Lafayette said, "VLC Tranquility Tenders 0126, do you read? We have a blind spot, and I believe you are in it. Could you please move more to your port side?" With the airlock doors closed, the tender complied and moved to port. "We read you, Lafayette, and are moving to port." Along the catwalk in the rear, the security team followed the passageways they had outlined in their plan, based upon the schematics sent from Ms. Haruta. There was a vulnerable section between the reactors on the top side of the ship. The plating was thin, and there were no bulkheads, conduits, or air ducts, or anything sensitive that would impair the craft if damaged. Underneath the plating was a passageway. Sergeant Fisher brought the tools up to the breach point. She enclosed herself inside a repair tent used when atmospheric pressure was required on the outside of the ship. Another member of the team pressed the adhesive seal of the tent down to the exterior plating of the ship. Once the seal looked and felt secure, she cracked the regulator of an air bottle and let the pressure inside the tent slowly bleed up to 1 atmosphere. Cutting off the gas bottle, she monitored the pressure to see if it was holding, and it was. Next, she drilled a 1 centimeter diameter hole through the plating and into the ship. With a fiber optic viewer, she pushed the viewing head through the hole and angled it about, seeing if anyone was back here. It seemed that it was a slow night, with not much going on. Another one of her crew went forward of her position in a tent to where the ship's identifier was attached. Pulling another identifier out of a bag, he magnetically attached it to the plating of the ship. Carefully, he dismounted the Lafayette identifier and exposed the wire harness attachment plug. Pulling it apart, he reattached it to the replacement he brought on board. When turned on, the new one would identify the ship as the Kananobu Maru, regardless of what shenanigans were being played inside. This was the team's equivalent of raising the proper flag over their ship again. Seeing that there was no one in the rear corridors, Fisher marked a circle on the outer hull with the hole at the center. Firing up her saw, she cut the circular piece of the hull plating where she had marked it. She worked fast and popped the disc through the hole and followed it soon after. As the disc floated there, she popped up and pulled in her tools and the air bottle. Outside, she left a disc 80 millimeters larger in diameter than the disc she cut, with an equal-sized center hole. She applied a generous amount of adhesive to the underside circumference of the larger disc, overlapping the smaller by about 40 centimeters. Popping up again, she pulled herself halfway out of the hole, running a bolt through the center holes of the discs. She brought down the plate with the smaller disc first. Passing the bolt through the flat metal bar on the inside, she tightened a nut on the innermost side, clamping the disc into the hole with the bar. Finally, she had applied a copious amount of caulking gel to the circular seam of the metal plate and around the bolt hole through the discs. This she did very quickly, for she did not know what lights were going off up on the bridge. She knew that large fluctuations in the air pressure would certainly have set off alarms. This was the fastest way she thought to get in without drawing a lot of attention. Satisfied that the hull was sealed, since the tent was on the outside, she ran around to the rear corridor and airlock to let in the rest of the team. Once the security team was all inside, Fisher took one man with her to the bridge, while the rest went into the habitat ring toward the living and recreation quarters. There was another version of the bridge in the habitat unit which was used for long runs when the critical burns were not being done. Generally used in port, the more traditional bridge was at the front of the ship. They wanted to be sure the security team all wore full pressure suits, so these crewmen would not recognize who they were, just like on the Mars raid. When Fisher and her man shot into the main bridge in 0G, there was no one there but the radio man, watching a Mars sitcom and eating tortilla chips. When he turned around, his eyes were as big as saucers, and he was shitting bricks. "Who the hell are you guys?" was all he could say before they pulled his hands behind his back to zip-tie him to his chair. Fisher's man, Jensen, grabbed the microphone jack and plugged it into his helmet. "VLC Tranquility, tender 0126, do you copy? Tranquility tenders at your service. We've changed our mind on that fuel, and we'd like to see what items you have that our ordinary service does not have." "Copy? Tranquility tenders, we copy. Please unlock your forward docking and loading port. Thank you." To everyone else around L2, this was just a normal early evening routine. Back in Habitat, the crew was gathered around in the rec room watching a movie. The room was dark, and they were engrossed in the action. They didn't notice the security team slipping in fully armed and blocking the exits. Finally, one realized they were not alone and said, "Did you dudes come for pizza night?" Their captain was there, but figured these people were company security coming to catch them at something and maybe scare them a bit. A couple of the security men tried to question each of them, but it soon became clear that their story had merit. Their employer, who was a general-purpose hauler, bought this rig about 8 months ago. The crew had spent a fair amount of time doing basic housekeeping and preventative maintenance that the previous owners had neglected. The security men and Haruta Metals crewmen did sympathize with these folks when they heard the story later on. They spent a lot of hours cleaning up someone else's mess, and now they were being evicted. Jensen unlocked the forward cargo airlock for Captain Otoome and his crew. They were wearing full pressure suits just in case. They made several trips hauling their personal items, along with tools and other things they liked to travel with. Stowing them along one side of the cargo bay, they made their way into the habitat where the current crew were zip-tied and a bit drunk. It wasn't going to be easy getting these folks to start cleaning out their crap if they were in this shape. It would be a few hours before they needed to deal with it, since they had to get the ship ready to travel. Someone was already monitoring the fuel transfers. The external lockout codes to scram the reactors were reset, so no one could stop them that way. Once they had a few hours to sober up and get their heads screwed on straight, the crew of the Lafayette pitched in, started pulling their things together, and loaded them onto the tender. Next, they sat with Captain Otoome and his crew, not knowing who they were, and related everything they had noticed about the behavior of the vessel. Older items that both crews had become familiar with, along with a few new issues they should keep an eye on. They were not happy getting kicked off this ship, because they had come to love it, but they understood and showed professional courtesy. After the Kananobu Maru, crew showed them several key serial numbers in several out-of-the-way places only they would know of. It was accepted that this was the real deal. The ship had been stolen. The captain and other officers made copies of the ship's logs with some personal ones and gave them to Otoome as an added gesture of aid and understanding. With fueling completed, the security team boarded the tender where the Lafayette crew was already strapped in. They said their goodbyes at the airlock where they could remove their helmets and not be seen. Captain Otoome and Sergeant Fisher thought they had done pretty good work for a mission thrown together in such a rush, but it was not over, and it had not really hit the fan yet. VLC TT-0126 disengaged from the Kananobu Maru and embarked on her trip back to Armstrong City. Calculating the proper trajectory and turning on the ship identifier, the Kananobu Maru fired her rockets to break orbit. Captain Otoome ordered the power from the reactors increased. Plasma was being superheated, shaped, and expelled to accelerate her return to Mars. Chapter 24. The Unveiling. Late in the afternoon, the crew of the Lafayette made an appearance at the Aldrin Arms Hotel in Armstrong City, Mare Frigoris, Luna. Accompanied by a lawyer for interplanetary freighters, they spoke of how they were forced to leave their ship because it was alleged to have been stolen. They believed the people who evicted them because they knew the ship inside and out, showing them parts of the craft only a long-term crew would know about. They told him the name of the ship was the Kananobu Maru. At this, most of the audience at the hotel gasped out loud. Everyone remembered when the Kananobu and the Nakamura disappeared without a trace, explanation, or any kind of trouble. She left Mars for the belt and then never returned. Only 2 months after she was due to arrive, there was a mysterious call to a reporter telling her of a warehouse in Copernicus, New Settlements, where the crew could be found. She called security at Haruta Metals to come with her. The entire crew was found alive and well, but pretty shaken up from the whole ordeal. At the press conference, the lawyer discounted any claims that interplanetary freighters had purchased stolen property or put their employees in danger at any time. Michael Duesenberg was a corporate/celebrity lawyer who loved the limelight and would say almost anything to stay in it. He insinuated that the people who took the Lafayette were probably pirates themselves. No one knew because they kept their identities secret the whole time, and this was certainly damning behavior. Why should victims of a crime be ashamed to speak? He even went so far as to accuse Haruta Metals of taking the Lafayette. At this, a reporter asked, "How could a company be accused of stealing their own property?" This kind of bald logic just irritated the crap out of Duesenberg. "We can't have people running around taking the law into their own hands, now can we?" The teamster in the back could not resist. "Isn't that what you're doing, Duesenberg, taking the law into your own hands?" That got a good laugh from the other haulers. One of the independents shouted, "You could bet your ass if any pirates took my ship, there would be hell to pay." From there, the conference had degenerated into mayhem. Duesenberg retreated with his reluctant clients to the upstairs rooms. Fernico put in a call to Trevor late that evening, asking if he had seen the circus in Armstrong City. Of course, did we expect anything different? No one wants to be known for buying stolen property. If that's what happened, blaming the victim is de rigueur. Kick them when they're down, as well as when they're not looking. Finding out what actually did happen is not in vogue. Ms. Haruta interrupted his rant. "Van Leeuwan, son, I'm talking about the reporters for once, and the audience, not that idiot Duesenberg. I'm saying we keep pointing out the fact that most of us know what a real crime is, rather than what the lawyers want you to think. People are not that dumb. They're just too exhausted to fight. Real crimes are committed against people, not some nebulous collective." "So you think we should unveil the Nakamura Maru then, and the pirate crews have to be made available? That's an even bigger issue, since we are raising such a ruckus about reparations. Right now, they're in detention at Viking Plaza under the auspices of Frontier Threat Management. As I said before, those guys, no matter what, deserve a fair trial. We don't have a complete set of logs from the 3 ships, but we have enough to put several of them away. Surprisingly, a handful of crewmen from each ship are on the verge of rolling on their friends. They know that justice on the frontier is far different than on Earth, Moon, or the nation's treaty enclaves. My people have some pretty good ideas on the identities of the other 2 ships, and they should confirm with your security. The taking of 2 additional ships will give us a lot more ammunition. I hope you are ready for the incoming barrage," Trevor said as he regained his confidence. Ms. Haruta said, "You sounded hesitant there, Mr. Van Leeuwan. I was getting worried. But you have awakened a sleeping giant and filled her with a terrible resolve." Trevor had to laugh now, breaking the tension he was feeling. Then he said, "I believe I can get us into the Pathfinder ballroom in the early afternoon tomorrow. I will shoot for 1 p.m. local time. Our lawyers have been scrambling to put this thing together because of the time constraints. I will confirm the time later tonight or very early in the morning. I will get us a live feed from drill site number 1 for a view of the Nakamura Maru during the press conference." Fernico said, "Please make the arrangements, Trevor. We will be there on time and ready." Very late that evening, VLC and Haruta Metals sent out a joint communique regarding their press conference the next day. The conference would be at 1:30 p.m. local time at the Pathfinder Ballroom in Leibniz. Fernico and Trevor were both there, both preferring to speak for themselves and their companies. Lawyers were present to go over the preliminary evidence. Ms. Haruta stepped up to the microphone and lowered it slightly so she could be heard. "To the ladies and gentlemen of the press, our wonderful customers, and the public at large, thank you for attending this press conference on such short notice. Now, you have all had time to take in last night's news regarding the taking of the Lafayette, or the Kananobu Maru, as the case may be. I can tell you this, the Kananobu Maru was registered to Haruta Metals, and well known to myself and her crew." She continued, "On my left, you see images taken of a very similar ship, last seen at Earth Moon L2 less than 1 week ago. The images to the right of that are the engineering schematics and photos of her right out of space dock. Furthermore, the images to Mr. Van Leeuwan's right are those of the Kananobu Maru and the Nakamura Maru together, with an animation showing the movement and matching of their respective clamps and airlock transfer ports. Most paired ships nowadays have industry-standard spacing for these mating subsystems. The Nakamura Maru is an older ship that did not comply with this standard. Not to date myself or our ship, but I know her well because she was the favorite of my father's. As a little girl, I spent a great deal of time aboard her and know every square centimeter by heart. The ship's registries will back up our ownership of these two vessels in due time. Stepping back from the podium, Ms. Haruta motioned for Van Leeuwan to step forward. Readjusting the microphone and bending down slightly, he began, "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe you all know Ms. Haruta's fine reputation. The taking of her ships was a crime, and any 6-year-old can tell you that. It's just too bad that 6-year-olds don't sit on the bench when they are needed." Trevor smiled and continued. "To begin with, Ms. Haruta has already personally identified the Nakamura Maru, which is being held at an undisclosed location." With that, he pointed to the large screen in the ballroom. There were a few trusted reporters there in pressure suits as the camera passed over the hull of the ship inside the hangar. At least 3 people in pressure suits were walking around the outside of the vessel, panning their cameras. The reporter in the first feed said, "We are here in a hangar with the ship everyone thought to be lost last year. If you look closely, you'll notice here on the side of the craft where the name Nakamura Maru was painted over. The original script is still faint but visible." The crowd at the Pathfinder was getting louder, and Trevor jumped in again. "You can see here on the display to my right some more overhead shots of the vessel indicating where the docking clamps and airlocks are located. If there are any engineers out there, your software could do the math for you on exact distances. Now for the real reporters out there, if you go through your files, you might be able to match this ship with some other recent video. Not only was this vessel taken in a crime, we contend that she was used attempting at least one other act of piracy." At that, Trevor had the video of the attack on the Philo T. Farnsworth replayed. Still shots of the Nakamura Maru at approximately the same angles were shown side by side with the current images. "In fact, not only do we believe she was involved in that attack, but the 2 others we have in custody are even more sure of due to the damage inflicted on them and the matching of their armaments." The reporters were snapping out of their shock. "What do you mean, in custody, Mr. Van Leeuwan?" shouted one reporter. "Are you really holding these ships?" shouted another. Van Leeuwan knew he had to accelerate this or there would be chaos before he could finish. "We split the reporter pool and they're being taken to the other 2 ships. In a minute we will get confirmation." The first reporter in the split pool appeared on the big screen. The large craft was behind her and the camera panned back to take it all in. "Ladies and gentlemen, you see here another craft which looks remarkably close to the one in the Farnsworth video. The markings are the same and it looks like small meteorite damage in the front. We're showing stills from the video for comparison. We were told that investigators were still working over the ship as a crime scene to gather any further clues as to her identity." Trevor took over the video feed again. "Now, the pool reporters should be next to the last and most dramatic piece of physical evidence." Then switching to the last hangar, they caught the reporter. "Look at this. This is the ship that took so much damage in the Farnsworth piracy video. Notice the twisted metal and makeshift vacuum repairs where those turrets were smashed." The reporters and their cameras were allowed at least half an hour with each ship before they were taken back to the settlements. They were blindfolded and did not know really where they had been. That did not detract from their video and their being able to see and touch the exteriors of the ships. Their images would be broadcast and analyzed all over the occupied Sol system. The reporters were going nuts, along with the onlookers at the Pathfinder ballroom. Everyone had written off these ships as gone for good. This type was exactly the craft pirates pursued most viciously. I guess now is the time for me to drop the big one, as they say, Van Leeuwan intoned. When these ships were retrieved, there were crews living on them, and had been for some time, by the looks of things. These 3 crews were captured, along with the ships and limited logs. We intend to try them for piracy and possession of stolen property here on the Mars frontier. They are currently in custody at Viking Plaza. We are releasing the names of those we have identified, along with the video showing them in their holding areas, so that others may identify them. VLC and Haruta Metals both contract with Frontier Threat Management for enforcement services. Please contact Viking Plaza to meet with the suspects for family visitation or representation. Please contact the legal departments of VLC or Haruta Metals to obtain discovery materials and a complete list of charges. Negotiations regarding the arbitration process may also be taken up with our attorneys. Marjorie Sipes, Olympus Mons Journal. Mr. Van Leeuwan, can you tell us where these ships were found and by whom? It's now or never, thought Trevor. Yes, Ms. Sipes, I will tell you exactly where we found them. They were parked at the Northern Military Reserve west of Olympus Mons. Suddenly a hush went over the room, but did not discourage a certain reporter in the back. Trevor waved and pointed. Anthony? The reporter spoke loudly. Anthony Tommaso, Marsnet. Mr. Van Leeuwan, are you saying that the military or JSO had these men in custody already? Taking his time, Trevor said. Actually, that was not the case at all. The suspects appeared to be going about their business or relaxing in the respective ships. There was no evidence that they were under arrest, and in fact, they seemed quite chummy with each other. If they were under arrest, they would not have been living on the ships with full access to evidence. Armed resistance was encountered from the base personnel when extracting both the men and the ships from the reserve. One could call it obstruction of justice. Yes, Katya? Katya Ivanova, from the Olympus Mons Journal, asked, Are you saying that there is some collusion going on between the JSO and pirates attacking our shipping? Van Leeuwan stepped away from the podium slightly. Katya, I don't have any direct evidence of that, but the JSO brought back those ships, and we never heard a thing about it. Not about arrests or anything else. So were they protecting their prisoners or preventing them from breaking out, or both? Why did they not try to prevent an act of piracy in the first place? Was there any investigation at all? These are the questions that Ms. Haruta and myself would like answered. We hope that a trial will bring us closer to the truth. Perhaps the press will do some digging regarding connections to the JSO. Trevor looked around the room. Yes, you, sir, in the gray suit. The well-dressed younger man stood up. Todd Kaiser, Washington Chronicles, sir. Are you implying that the government would work hand in hand with criminals? Surely they know much better how to handle these situations. Are you perhaps still stinging from the detaining of the crew of the Farnsworth? Trevor thought for a moment how to answer. Mr. Kaiser, I am not impressed with governments and never have been. Nearly everyone on Mars knows that, along with quite a few on Earth, governments are made up of human beings, 99.9999% of which are not elected. What they claim to do for people, people are already doing. Every crisis is seen by government and their cronies as an opportunity to enhance their own power and profits. Just take a look here in the new settlements. The nation's treaty sector is tearing their hair out over this boycott rather than doing the right thing. In another month, they will have to pack up and go home. They never learned that they would be looking out for themselves by looking out for others. How many of them have resigned already? Ferniko Haruta stepped forward. I just wanted to say again how happy I am that the Nakamura Maru has returned along with your companion. We are all hoping for real justice and to put a damper on these pirates by actually making them pay. We will have more information for you periodically. All of the information we have shared with you today has been made available through our 2 companies and their legal departments. Thank you all for coming. The group made their way into a private conference room as the reporters slowly gave up on getting in more questions.